A lone prophet stood against kings, queens, and 400 voices crying to a silent God, and fire fell from heaven. His name was Elijah, and his story still burns through history as both a warning and a promise. The Omri dynasty rose from turbulence. Omri, a military commander who seized the throne after years of bloodshed, proved shrewd in ways Israel had rarely seen. He secured alliances, consolidated scattered tribes, and purchased a hill to build his new capital, Samaria, a fortress city that announced permanence. Under his hand and his son Ahab's, the northern kingdom became politically secure, wealthy from trade routes, and militarily formidable enough to command respect even from Aram and Assyria. For the first time in generations, Israel was not merely surviving, it was thriving. Yet strength in politics concealed rot in spirit. Omri cared little for the covenant traditions that had once bound Israel to its God. His dynasty measured success not by faithfulness to Yahweh but by wealth, tribute, and the marriage contracts that secured peace with neighboring empires. When Ahab ascended, this logic reached its peak. His marriage to Jezebel, daughter of the king of Tyre, joined Israel's fortunes to Phoenicia's sea-trading empire. Along with her dowry, Jezebel carried her gods. Baal and Asherah soon had temples and altars in Samaria, tended by hundreds of priests subsidized from the royal treasury. The people followed the example of their rulers. Farmers who once brought offerings to Yahweh's altars now turned to Baal, the storm god who promised rain and fertile fields. His rituals, imported from Tyre and Sidon, promised prosperity in exchange for loyalty, and in a land ravaged by droughts and thin harvests, the temptation was irresistible. To many, Baal seemed practical, immediate, and powerful, while Yahweh's covenant, with its demands of justice and exclusive worship, felt abstract and costly. The prophets of Yahweh were silenced, some slaughtered, others forced into hiding. Under Ahab's reign, Israel glittered with new architecture, fortified cities, and commercial wealth. The king's ivory palace gleamed with imported luxury, and his court buzzed with foreign influences. Yet the prophets saw another reality beneath the surface. Covenant faith unraveling, a people limping between gods, and justice strangled by idolatry. The Omrides embodied a paradox: political brilliance and economic success achieved by surrendering the very identity that had once set Israel apart. The dynasty's legacy would be recorded not only in trade treaties and military campaigns but in the spiritual vacuum it left behind, into which figures like Elijah would soon step, fiery and uncompromising. She came from Tyre, a daughter of the Phoenician coast, where the smell of salt and incense mingled in bustling harbors, and Baal's temples rose above merchant stalls. Jezebel had been reared in the palace of Ethbaal, both king and high priest, a man who had seized power through bloodshed and held it with ruthless devotion to the gods of his ancestors. From childhood she learned to see political power and religious loyalty as inseparable. The throne and the altar bound together in one authority. When she married Ahab, it was not merely a union of two houses, but the fusion of two worlds. She crossed the sea and entered Samaria not as a foreign bride, but as an evangelist of her gods, bringing Baal's cult into Israel's heart. From the moment she arrived, she unsettled the fragile balance of the northern kingdom. Other foreign queens had brought their household gods, but Jezebel did not confine Baal to her private chambers. She built a temple in Samaria with her husband's support, installed prophets at court, and ensured the cult received royal patronage. Yahweh's altars, long neglected, now stood in the shadow of Baal's shrines, their smoke dim beside the thunder god's sacrifices. Farmers desperate for rain turned to Jezebel's priests, who promised fertile fields in exchange for devotion. Her confidence was magnetic, her authority unshaken, and the people, weary of uncertainty, drifted after her. Jezebel was no passive figurehead. She ruled with the conviction that Baal's worship was not merely permitted but preeminent. She silenced Yahweh's prophets, hunting them down with a fury born of both zeal and politics. To Jezebel, devotion to Baal was loyalty to the crown, while clinging to Yahweh represented rebellion. She turned religion into a test of allegiance, drawing a line through the nation that forced every Israelite to choose. Ahab, pragmatic and pliant, allowed her zeal to shape the court, and together they presided over an Israel richer and stronger than before, yet estranged from its covenant roots. Her name became synonymous with defiance, not because she lacked courage, but because she wielded it in service of a god. Israel's prophets declared powerless. To her, Yahweh was a provincial deity, one among many, dwarfed by Baal's thunder and Sidon's splendor. To Elijah and those who remained faithful, she was a force of desecration, the embodiment of foreign power corrupting Israel from within. Jezebel carried with her the energy of Tyre's harbors, the stubbornness of a priestess, and the will of a queen who believed herself untouchable. Yet the very certainty that made her formidable would also make her blind to the storm gathering on the horizon. A storm that no Baal, however mighty, would be able to command. Baal was no obscure household idol, but the great storm god of the Phoenicians, lord of rain and fertility, the one who made crops sprout and herds multiply. In Tyre and Sidon, his temples rose high above marketplaces, their altars blackened by generations of sacrifice. His image, cast in bronze or carved from cedar, often showed him with a raised arm clutching a thunderbolt, poised to strike the earth with the force of life. To farmers along the Mediterranean coast, Baal's favor was the difference between abundance and famine, between prosperity and starvation. His myths told of battles with Mot, the god of death, and his cyclical victory meant the return of spring rains after dry seasons. The rhythm of agriculture was tied to his story, and rituals reenacted his triumph each year to ensure the land would flourish. The cult that Jezebel brought into Israel carried with it these ancient traditions. Temples were built not just as places of prayer, but as centers of economic and political power, supported by royal treasury and guarded by armies of priests. Sacrifices flowed daily: grain, wine, cattle, sometimes more troubling offerings whispered about in Israelite ears. Baal worship included ecstatic rites, where priests and worshippers sought to stir the god to action through frenzied dances, loud cries, and bloodletting. They believed that by imitating the god's struggle, cutting their own flesh to mirror his battle with Mot, they could persuade him to release the rains locked in the heavens. Alongside him stood Asherah, goddess of fertility, often honored with carved poles planted near shrines. Together, their cult promised to unlock life's deepest powers: fertility of soil, womb, and flock. For Israelites facing dry seasons and fragile harvests, the appeal was obvious. Yahweh demanded exclusive loyalty and promised blessings bound to covenant faithfulness. Baal's priests offered immediate, visible rituals that seemed to guarantee rain. To a people wavering between faith and fear, the storm god's cult appeared practical, even scientific, in a world without meteorology. The rituals gave worshippers a sense of control, as though the right offerings and chants could bend the heavens to their will. What Yahweh framed as trust, Baal's priests packaged as technique. Yet beneath its promise of life, the cult carried a darker edge. By tying fertility to ritual frenzy and political allegiance, it enslaved worshippers to constant performance. Priests demanded devotion, rulers enforced conformity, and those who resisted were marginalized or worse. What had once been Israel's defining difference, a people bound to one God, trusting his covenant, was steadily eroded. In its place grew a religion that blurred moral lines, reduced worship to transaction, and bound society to the rhythms of fear and appeasement. The cult of Baal entered Israel not as a minor foreign influence, but as a rival kingdom within the kingdom, a challenge not only to Yahweh's prophets, but to Israel's very identity. The memory of Sinai had not vanished, but under Ahab it grew faint, like an echo in a cavern slowly swallowed by silence. Yahweh's covenant, once the pulse of Israel's life, was now obscured beneath layers of compromise. In Samaria, the king's new temple to Baal stood gleaming, its smoke rising daily, while Yahweh's altars lay abandoned, stones cracked and weeds pushing through the crevices. The feasts of the Lord, once occasions for the tribes to gather and remember their deliverance, were neglected, replaced by rituals imported from Sidon. Songs that had once celebrated Yahweh's mighty acts now mingled uneasily with chants to Baal. To the younger generation, raised under Jezebel's court, the covenant seemed like an old story fading into irrelevance. The prophets felt the change most keenly. Once they had spoken freely in the marketplaces, urging justice and calling Israel back to its God. Now their words carried a death sentence. Jezebel's agents hunted them with deliberate fury, slaughtering some, scattering others into caves and secret places. Obadiah, Ahab's own servant, risked his life to hide 100 prophets in the wilderness, feeding them with bread and water in defiance of the queen. Most Israelites saw only the surface, the wealth of Ahab's palace, the abundance Baal's priests promised, the pageantry of new festivals. Few noticed the absence of voices crying in Yahweh's name, or if they did, they were too afraid to speak. The decline was not only religious but moral. The covenant had bound worship to justice, requiring the care of the poor, honesty in trade, and mercy in judgment. Without it, power flowed unchecked. Landholders seized fields with impunity, courts favored the wealthy, and violence simmered beneath prosperity's veneer. The law of Yahweh, once the safeguard of the weak, was ignored by rulers who measured strength by military victories and foreign alliances. To forget the covenant was not simply to neglect a deity, but to unravel the very fabric of a society that had been shaped by divine justice. And yet, a remnant endured. Scattered households still whispered Yahweh's name in prayer, still told their children the stories of deliverance from Egypt and conquest of the land. In hidden valleys and dark caves, the prophets who remained faithful clung to their calling, waiting for the moment when God would speak again. Israel had not utterly abandoned its God. Rather, it limped between two allegiances, hedging bets between Baal's immediate promises and Yahweh's ancient covenant. In that hesitation lay the nation's peril, for divided hearts cannot endure long. Into this silence, when Yahweh seemed forgotten and his prophets silenced, a solitary figure from the hills of Gilead would step forward, unyielding and fiery, to remind Israel that its God was not dead, only waiting to be remembered. He came from nowhere, a man whose very name meant, "My God is Yahweh," Elijah the Tishbite, from a village east of the Jordan that few in Samaria would have bothered to mark on a map, stepped suddenly onto the stage of history without lineage or preparation. Scripture offers no genealogy to anchor him, no account of apprenticeship under elder prophets. He arrived like a storm cloud over dry land, a solitary voice carrying the weight of heaven's authority. To Israelite ears accustomed to priests robed in ceremony and prophets schooled in tradition, Elijah must have seemed a contradiction, a rugged stranger wrapped in a mantle of haircloth, with eyes that burned as though they had already seen things too great to speak. His obscurity was his power. Unlike priests tied to temple wealth or courtiers bound by royal favor, Elijah carried no allegiance but to Yahweh. He lived with the wilderness in his bones, hardened by barren hills and desert winds, where dependence on God was not a doctrine but daily bread. From such solitude came the voice that would confront kings. His sudden appearance before Ahab shocked the court. No hesitation, no deference, only a declaration sharp as a sword: there would be no dew or rain except by his word. In a land where life hinged on water, it was more than prophecy, it was war. Yahweh against Baal, the covenant God against the storm god who claimed the skies. Elijah's presence unsettled more than the king. He embodied an older Israel, the wilderness generation that had known manna and thunder at Sinai, the people who followed cloud and fire rather than palace and priest. In him the covenant reappeared not as distant memory but as living fire. His very obscurity reminded Israel that God often chooses unlikely vessels, a shepherd for a king, a slave people for a nation, a man from Tishbe for a prophet. Yet beneath his fierce words lay a human heart. Elijah would know hunger and fear, exhaustion and despair, as deeply as any other. He was no invulnerable figure of legend, but a man carried by the God he served, stumbling and rising again in rhythm with the message he bore. His sudden appearance in Ahab's palace was only the beginning of a journey that would lead him to brooks sustained by ravens, to widows on the brink of death, to mountains aflame with divine presence. But in that first moment, all Israel saw was a stranger from the wilderness who dared speak as if heaven itself bent to his voice. The man from Tishbe had come, and nothing in Israel would remain the same. The throne room of Samaria was not accustomed to interruption. Ahab sat surrounded by courtiers and priests, the air thick with incense from Baal's altar, when a man from the wilderness strode unannounced across the polished floor. His garments were rough, his beard unkempt, his eyes burning with a light that silenced the room more effectively than any guard could. Elijah did not bow, nor did he offer courtesy. He spoke a single sentence that shattered the ease of Ahab's reign. As Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives, there would be neither dew nor rain in the land except at his command. No negotiation, no explanation, only a stark pronouncement that turned the court's laughter to whispers. In a kingdom built on Baal's promise of rain, Elijah's words were not merely bold, they were blasphemous. Baal was worshipped as the storm bringer, the one who cracked the skies and poured water on thirsty fields. For Elijah to declare that rain now lay in Yahweh's hand alone was a direct challenge, a stripping of power from the God whom Jezebel had enthroned in Israel. The silence after his words must have been electric, the kind that hangs before a storm. Yet the storm was not Baal's to give. Ahab, furious and incredulous, heard his own authority mocked, for if the skies withheld rain, famine would gnaw his people, trade would wither, and royal strength would falter. Elijah did not linger. Having delivered his message, he vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving the court in stunned disarray. The priests of Baal rushed to assure the king that their God would not be mocked, that rains would come with the right sacrifices. But the days stretched into weeks, and the skies held their silence. Dew no longer kissed the fields at dawn, clouds no longer gathered on the horizon. Crops wilted, rivers thinned, and the land began to crack beneath a relentless sun. With each dry sunrise, Elijah's words gained weight, and the priest's chants rang more hollow. The drought was not simply a natural disaster, but a theological crisis. Every shriveled vine and barren field testified against Baal. Every empty cistern whispered that Yahweh still ruled the heavens. Elijah's prophecy had placed the nation in a crucible. Would they cling to Baal, desperate for rituals to restore his favor, or would they remember the God who once split seas and thundered from Sinai? For Ahab and Jezebel, the drought was a humiliation. For Elijah, it was proof that a lone prophet armed only with Yahweh's word could bring a kingdom to its knees. The rainless skies became his silent allies, echoing his declaration, "No rain except by my word." When the words had left his mouth and the sky began its long silence, Elijah himself became a hunted man. Ahab seethed with anger. Jezebel's priests whispered of vengeance, and the land where he had spoken so boldly was no longer safe. The prophet who had declared drought now had to live within it, tasting the cost of his own message. Yahweh led him eastward, away from Samaria's walls and into the solitude of the wilderness, to a narrow stream hidden among rugged hills. The Wadi Kerith, a seasonal brook cutting through the dry land, became his refuge. There he drank from clear waters that trickled stubbornly in defiance of the hardening skies. But water alone could not sustain him, and in the desolation there were no fields to glean from, no villages to beg bread. It was then the unlikely began. Each morning and evening ravens swooped low over the brook, their dark wings flashing against the light, dropping morsels of bread and meat into the prophet's hands. Creatures known for scavenging and selfishness became servants of provision, messengers of a God who commanded even the wild to feed his own. Elijah, who had no court to support him, no household to prepare his meals, now ate from the beaks of birds. In that hidden place, cut off from the noise of palace and people, the prophet learned the weight of dependence. His survival did not rest on stored grain or royal favor, but on daily gifts delivered in ways no one could have predicted. Each morning he waited, not knowing if the ravens would come again, and each evening they arrived, faithful as the God who sent them. The brook and the birds formed a rhythm of trust, a quiet liturgy of provision beneath the cloudless heavens. The irony was sharp. While Baal's priests cut themselves and chanted for rain that never came, Yahweh's servant was fed in secret, sustained not by the storm but by the simplest tokens of care. The one who had spoken judgment now lived inside grace, a paradox written into his very life. Every bite reminded him that the covenant God was no distant deity but one who saw, who provided, who could turn even scavengers into stewards. As the days stretched into weeks, Elijah's solitude became preparation. The brook was a place of stripping, where a man who had stood before kings now learned to kneel in patience. The prophet's strength was not in his mantle or in the fire that would one day fall from heaven, but in this hidden schooling waiting beside a dwindling stream, fed by black-winged servants, learning to trust the God whose silence in the skies was matched by his faithfulness at the brook. When the brook finally dried, its stones baking in the relentless sun, Elijah rose from his hiding place and followed a new command. Yahweh sent him north, beyond Israel's borders, into Phoenician land itself, the territory of Jezebel's Baal. It seemed strange that a prophet of Yahweh would find refuge in Sidon's shadow, but the God who withheld rain from Israel was not bound by its borders. In a small town called Zarephath, he encountered a widow gathering sticks at the edge of the gate. Her figure bent low, her eyes tired from hunger. She had nothing left but a handful of flour in a jar and a trickle of oil in a jug, enough for one final meal with her son before death claimed them both. Elijah, dusty and lean from his wilderness journey, asked her for bread. The request sounded cruel in a land gasping from famine. Yet he spoke with quiet authority, telling her not to fear, promising that if she fed him first, her jar and jug would not run empty until the rains returned. It was a gamble that defied reason, a test of trust from a stranger whose God she did not know. Still, something in his words stirred her, and she chose obedience over despair. She baked a small cake and placed it before him. The miracle unfolded in silence. Each morning when she reached into the jar, flour clung to her fingers. Each evening when she tilted the jug, oil flowed, never abundant, never overflowing, but always enough. Day after day, she and her son and the prophet ate, and the miracle became routine, a quiet defiance of hunger. In the land of Baal, Yahweh's compassion sustained not just his prophet but a foreign woman and her child, as if to declare that his mercy was wider than Israel's soil. Yet life in that house was not free from sorrow. The widow's son fell sick, breath slipping from his body until he lay still in death. Grief overwhelmed her, and in her anguish she turned on Elijah, accusing him of exposing her sins to God and bringing punishment upon her household. For a moment it seemed the miracle of bread and oil had only delayed inevitable loss. But Elijah carried the boy to the upper room, laid him upon his bed, and cried out to Yahweh with raw intensity. He stretched himself over the lifeless frame and pleaded 3 times for breath to return. And breath did return. The boy's chest rose again, his eyes opened, and Elijah delivered him back into his mother's arms. In that moment the widow's hesitation dissolved. She confessed that Elijah was truly a man of God, and that his words carried truth. In the house of a foreigner, amid famine and despair, Yahweh revealed himself not only as judge of nations but as sustainer of life, a God who multiplies meager resources and restores what death has stolen. Death had entered the house quietly, stealing the breath of the widow's only son. The boy who had lived on flour and oil granted by miracle now lay motionless, his small body a cruel contrast to the daily provision that had sustained him. His mother's grief broke into anger, for sorrow often seeks someone to blame. She turned on Elijah, the stranger who had brought God's presence into her home. "Have you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her cry carried both accusation and despair, the voice of one who had dared to hope only to be crushed by loss. Elijah himself was shaken. He had spoken words that stopped the skies, prayed prayers that filled jars with sustenance. Yet now he faced the silence of death, and for a moment he had no answer. He carried the lifeless boy to the upper chamber, laid him on his bed, and fell upon his knees. His prayer was raw and unvarnished. "O Yahweh, my God, have you brought tragedy even upon the widow with whom I stay, by causing her son to die?" He stretched his body over the child 3 times, as if trying to pour his own warmth into cold flesh, and cried out again for life to return. The silence broke. Breath returned with a gasp, chest rising, eyes opening. Life, withheld for a moment, surged back into the child. Elijah lifted him in his arms, not triumphant but trembling, and descended to the waiting mother. When he placed the boy back in her embrace, the widow's words changed. No longer accusation, but confession. "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of Yahweh from your mouth is truth." This moment reached beyond one household. In Phoenicia, Baal was worshipped as the god of storm and fertility, the one who died and rose each year with the crops. But Baal's mythic cycle could not rescue a single child from death. The widow had lived under his shadow all her life, yet she saw in her own home what Baal had never done. Yahweh alone gave life back, not as seasonal myth but as personal miracle. The contest between gods had already begun, not on Mount Carmel but in a poor woman's upper room, where the God of Israel proved himself master not only of rain and drought but of breath itself. For Elijah, this was more than a victory, it was a deepening of his own faith. He had seen Yahweh provide, but now he saw him conquer the final enemy. The prophet carried in his heart the knowledge that he served not a distant deity of storm and sky, but the living God who held power over life and death. This truth would strengthen him for the greater trial still to come, when an entire nation would stand hesitating between gods, and fire from heaven would decide the question. The skies did not break. Day after day the sun scorched fields into dust, and night after night the stars looked down on a land with no dew to soften its hardness. What had begun as unease turned to calamity, then to desperation. Streams shrank into trickles, then vanished altogether. Herds collapsed on cracked earth, ribs sharp beneath thinning hides. Mothers held children who cried not from sickness but from hunger, their voices fading into silence when no food could be found. The drought stretched not for weeks but for years, each season repeating the curse that Elijah had declared. Whispers followed the famine like shadows. Some said Elijah had vanished into the wilderness, carried by ravens. Others claimed he had crossed borders and found shelter among foreigners. Still others swore he walked unseen through Israel's villages, pronouncing secret judgments and stirring rebellion. Ahab scoured the land, sending men to neighboring kingdoms with oaths to produce the prophet if they found him. But Elijah remained beyond reach, hidden in places where even the king's arm could not extend. His absence haunted Jezebel's court, a living wound that no sacrifice to Baal could heal. The priests of Baal grew louder as the land grew quieter. They multiplied their rituals, cutting themselves until blood mingled with dust, crying to the heavens for storms that never came. Their frenzy convinced no one. The people's faith in Baal, once bright with promise, flickered with every dry season. Yet Yahweh's altars lay in ruins, his prophets in hiding or slain. Israel staggered between despair and confusion, unsure where hope might still be found. Ahab himself grew restless, His kingdom, though still strong in walls and armies, could not withstand famine forever. Trade routes dried up along with rivers, and alliances frayed when neighboring kings saw Israel's weakness. In private moments, Ahab's gaze turned toward Jezebel, whose foreign gods had filled Samaria's temples but emptied its fields. Yet pride and stubbornness bound him better to rage against a missing prophet than admit the futility of Baal. Across the villages of Israel, the name of Elijah was spoken like a spell, half curse, half prayer. Some longed for his return, believing he alone could unlock the skies. Others cursed him as the cause of their suffering, a prophet who had abandoned his own people to starvation. His memory lingered like the hunger itself, unavoidable and bitter. 3 years passed in this silence. No rain fell, no dew softened the ground. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break. And in that waiting, the stage was set. When Elijah finally reappeared, it would not be as a fugitive but as a challenger, ready to confront the king, the priests, and the nation itself on the question that could no longer be ignored: who is God in Israel? In Ahab's palace, where Jezebel's will swept like a storm and Baal's prophets dined at the royal table, one man walked a dangerous line. His name was Obadiah, the king's steward, a trusted official who managed the affairs of court and kingdom. To most he appeared loyal, a servant who bowed when summoned and kept the palace running while Ahab raged and Jezebel schemed. But beneath that exterior beat a heart that still feared Yahweh, a rare flame flickering where nearly all light had been snuffed out. When Jezebel launched her purge against the prophets of Yahweh, sending soldiers to hunt them down, Obadiah acted with quiet defiance. In secret, he gathered 100 of them and split them into 2 groups, hiding them deep in caves where soldiers dared not search. By day, he walked the palace halls as though nothing were amiss. By night, he carried food and water through treacherous paths, risking discovery with every step. Each loaf of bread smuggled under his cloak, each jug of water lifted in the dark, was an act of rebellion against the queen whose power reached almost everywhere. Almost, but not into the heart of Obadiah. The courage he showed was not loud or fiery like Elijah's, but steady, the kind that chooses faithfulness over safety, one small act at a time. He knew the cost. If discovered, his body would hang as a warning, and the prophets he sheltered would be slaughtered beside him. Yet he persisted, keeping alive the voices that Jezebel sought to silence. He was proof that even within the court of Baal, Yahweh had not left himself without witness. His position forced him into daily compromise, dining with idolaters, listening to their chants, bowing in the king's presence while his soul recoiled. Some may have judged him a coward for remaining in Ahab's service, but without him the prophets would have starved, and Yahweh's remnant might have vanished. His was a different kind of calling. Not to thunder before kings, but to endure in their shadow, preserving what could be preserved until the time for confrontation arrived. In the famine years, Obadiah carried an additional burden. Ahab himself grew restless and sent him to scour the land for water and pasture, a grim task in a world shriveling under Elijah's word. As the steward walked beside his king, his secret weighed heavy. He, the protector of Yahweh's prophets, serving the ruler who hunted them. Every step was a prayer. Every word measured, every silence heavy with danger. Yet it was this man, torn between courtly duty and covenant loyalty, who would one day meet Elijah again on the dusty road, trembling at the sight of the prophet but faithful still. Obadiah's story reveals that courage wears many faces, sometimes loud as fire on a mountain, sometimes quiet as bread broken in the dark. The famine had stretched into its 3rd year when Elijah stepped from hiding and walked back into the land that had hunted him. The once proud fields of Israel were now brittle wastelands, the rivers trickling like dying veins, and even the animals groaned in their hunger. Ahab himself, king of a starving kingdom, rode through the countryside with Obadiah at his side, searching desperately for a patch of grass to keep the royal horses alive. It was in this barren landscape that Elijah appeared, sudden as ever, standing like a shadow on the road. When Ahab saw him, rage and relief clashed across his face. Here was the man who had vanished after pronouncing the curse, the prophet whose word had dried the heavens. Ahab's voice cut the air. "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" The accusation carried the desperation of a king undone, his power mocked by empty skies. To Ahab, Elijah was no prophet but the cause of famine, the one man whose stubborn defiance had brought ruin on the land. But Elijah did not flinch. His reply struck with the force of truth. "I have not troubled Israel. You and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of Yahweh and followed the Baals." The words landed like hammer blows, shifting the blame from prophet to palace, from the lone man before him to the dynasty that had abandoned covenant for idolatry. In that moment the drought was unmasked, not as Elijah's curse but as Yahweh's judgment on a nation that had traded its God for foreign gods. The standoff was more than personal enmity. It was the collision of two worldviews. Ahab saw power in alliances, wealth, and the rituals of Baal's priests. Elijah saw truth in obedience to a God who demanded exclusive devotion. Their exchange distilled years of conflict into a single clash of words. A king defending his throne, a prophet defending the covenant. Neither yielded, and the tension could not be sustained much longer. It was then that Elijah proposed the test that would define their generation. If Ahab truly believed Baal held power, let it be proven publicly. Gather all Israel at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who dined at Jezebel's table. There, before the eyes of the nation, the question would be settled. If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him. No more limping between two opinions. Ahab, cornered by famine and desperate for resolution, agreed. The meeting that began with accusation ended with a challenge, and the road between them became the path toward confrontation. The people of Israel, weary of hunger and silence, would soon gather on Carmel's heights to see which God still answered. And whether the troubler of Israel was prophet or king, the drought had stripped the land bare, leaving both king and people restless, when Elijah raised the stakes beyond rumor and famine. No longer content to deliver words in secret places, he demanded that the nation assemble, not in a marketplace or palace court, but on the broad slopes of Mount Carmel. The mountain, rising between the sea and the plain, carried weight in both traditions. A place where Baal's prophets claimed their God answered with storms, and where Israel's memory still held whispers of Yahweh's presence. It was the perfect stage for a trial of gods. Elijah's proposal was simple but daring. Let two altars be built, one for Baal and one for Yahweh. Let two bulls be chosen, cut, and placed upon wood, but without fire. Then let the prophets call on their God, and Elijah call on his, and whichever deity answered with fire would be acknowledged as the true God of Israel. No argument, no negotiation, only visible proof. The wager was direct, almost reckless, yet it cut through years of hesitation with sharp clarity. Israel had been limping between loyalties, hedging bets between covenant and compromise. Elijah's challenge demanded decision. Before the gathered crowd, his words pierced the air. How long will you go limping between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him. The people, weary of famine and disillusioned by priests who promised rain but delivered dust, stood silent. They had no defense, no reply. Their silence was not indifference but exhaustion, the sound of a people ready at last for resolution. For the prophets of Baal, the challenge was irresistible. 450 strong, bolstered by the court of Jezebel and the power of the throne, they believed the outcome already assured. Baal was the storm god, master of lightning, lord of fire from heaven. What better arena than to call down flame? Their confidence must have surged like the waves breaking on the coast below Carmel, certain that this was the day Elijah would be humiliated and his God discredited forever. Ahab, too, seized upon the proposal. His kingdom, bleeding under drought, needed an answer. To accept Elijah's wager was a gamble, but refusing would appear weakness. Better to trust in Jezebel's prophets and hope that Baal would vindicate his reign with spectacle. So word spread through the land, and Israel assembled on the mountain, drawn by hunger, curiosity, and the faint hope that the gods would finally speak. Thus the stage was set, the altars awaiting sacrifice, the nation waiting for fire. In the silence before the storm, Elijah stood alone against a sea of prophets, his wager hanging in the air like an unlit torch. What would follow would decide not only whose God answered, but whether Israel still had a God at all. The sun rose over Mount Carmel, casting long shadows across the rocky slopes where the crowd gathered in uneasy silence. Word had spread quickly through villages and towns. The prophets of Baal were to meet Elijah in a contest that would decide the fate of Israel's worship. From every corner of the land people came, farmers with dust on their faces, herdsmen leading weakened animals, mothers carrying children too thin from famine. Hunger drove them as much as curiosity. If the gods were to answer, perhaps relief would follow. Then came the prophets, 450 of them, clothed in fine garments dyed with Phoenician colors, their hair oiled, their voices rising in rehearsed chants. They marched in procession, a wave of ritual power, the living testimony of Jezebel's triumph. Some carried symbols of Baal carved thunderbolts, polished bronze idols, others raised staffs wrapped in bright cloths. They looked like certainty embodied, confident that their God, master of storm and flame, would vindicate them before the people. Ahab himself arrived in royal splendor, his presence both anxious and defiant. He had thrown his lot with Jezebel's priests, and now he needed their God to prove true. Behind him the royal guard stood ready, but their eyes betrayed unease. They, too, had seen the skies withhold rain, the rivers vanish, the crops turn to dust. They had watched Baal's rituals grow louder even as the land grew quieter. Israel's people, scattered on the mountainside, murmured among themselves. Some looked to the prophets of Baal and saw authority, pageantry, and numbers. Others glanced toward Elijah, solitary in his rough cloak, and wondered if truth might hide in such simplicity. Most were caught in the middle, too weary from drought to care which God answered, so long as someone finally broke the silence of heaven. Their faces showed hesitation, hope, and fear mingled together, the portrait of a nation unsure where to place its trust. Elijah stood apart, alone against the sea of priests, yet his presence carried a weight that no number could outweigh. He asked the people how long they would limp between two opinions, but no voice rose to answer him. Their silence testified more loudly than words their faith was brittle, their resolve shattered. They were waiting to see, unwilling to choose until fire itself made the decision for them. The mountain became an arena, two altars soon to be raised, one for Baal and one for Yahweh. The air was thick with tension, as though even creation held its breath. The priests arrayed themselves in proud formation, chanting invocations to their storm god. The crowd shuffled closer, their eyes flicking between the many and the one, between pageantry and rough prophecy. And so Israel stood, caught in suspense, a nation leaning forward to witness which God, if any, would still answer their cries. The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs rising like restless wind across the slopes of Carmel. Dust clung to weary faces, hunger hollowed their eyes, and still they waited, caught between hope and dread. Then Elijah stepped forward. His figure was stark against the brightness of the day, a single man in a rough cloak facing king, priests, and nation. His voice cut the air with the clarity of a blade. How long will you limp between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal, then follow him. The question fell heavy, more accusation than inquiry. The people had been hedging their lives for years, offering sacrifices at Baal's altars while still invoking Yahweh's name in private prayers. They had convinced themselves that divided worship meant security, that no matter which god proved stronger, they would be covered. But the drought had stripped away illusions. Fields were barren, cisterns cracked, and Baal had remained silent despite endless rituals. Still, the people hesitated. Their silence revealed the truth. Indecision is itself a decision. To limp between gods was to deny both. The covenant demanded loyalty, yet fear of Jezebel's power and the spectacle of Baal's priests bound their tongues. Some shifted uneasily, ashamed but unwilling to declare themselves. Others stared at the ground, waiting for someone else to answer first. None spoke. Elijah's words struck deeper than choice of deity. They exposed the fracture in Israel's soul. Once the people had been shaped by a story of deliverance, by a God who thundered from Sinai and fed them in the wilderness. Now that memory had dimmed, replaced by ritual pageantry and political convenience, they had become a people without clarity, limping between past and present, covenant and compromise. The prophets of Baal stood tall in their fine robes, smirking at the people's silence. Ahab, watching from his throne-like seat, no doubt felt vindicated by the crowd's hesitation. Yet Elijah did not waver. His challenge was not to please a king or sway a mob, but to reveal truth. The nation's indecision would not endure much longer. Soon the mountain itself would answer the question their lips refused to speak. For now the silence lingered, stretching unbearably, a void between two gods. The people stood suspended, unwilling to leap toward either altar. They were waiting for proof, for fire, for something undeniable to force their allegiance. Elijah's rebuke echoed across the slopes, and though no one replied, the words clung in their hearts. How long will you limp? It was not merely a question for that moment, but a judgment on their entire posture before God. They could not limp forever. One way or the other, the time of decision had come. Elijah's voice carried over the crowd, steady and unflinching, as he laid out the terms that would end the long silence of heaven. 2 altars would be built, one for Baal and one for Yahweh. 2 bulls would be chosen, equal in size and strength, so that neither side could claim advantage. Each would be cut and laid upon wood. But no fire would be kindled. The priests of Baal would call upon their God, and Elijah would call upon his. The God who answered by fire, he alone would be acknowledged as God in Israel. The simplicity of the challenge was its brilliance. No hidden tricks, no subtle arguments, only fire from heaven, the one sign neither altar could fake. For Baal's prophets, the terms were familiar and favorable. Fire from the storm god should be his specialty, lightning his weapon, flame his natural answer. To their ears, Elijah had chosen the very ground where Baal would appear strongest. Their confidence grew as they nodded and murmured approval. They had numbers, ritual, and tradition on their side. Surely this would end with Elijah humiliated, exposed as a lone agitator against the established order. For Elijah, the rules stripped away pretense. Israel had lingered too long in indecision, their loyalties blurred between Yahweh and Baal. This contest left no space for compromise. Either fire would fall, or it would not. Either the covenant God still ruled the heavens, or he did not. The matter would no longer rest on persuasion but on revelation. Elijah knew that truth needed no embellishment. If Yahweh answered, his people would see with their own eyes. The crowd murmured in assent, relieved perhaps that they would not need to speak until the fire decided for them. The people's silence had revealed their weakness, but their agreement showed their desperation. They wanted resolution, a clear sign to break the famine of certainty as much as the famine of food. Their nods carried both hope and resignation, hope that at last they would know which altar to bow before, in resignation that their choice had been forced by the drought that had consumed their land. Elijah allowed Baal's prophets the first turn. With 450 voices crying out in unison, their God would have every chance to prove himself. All morning would be theirs to summon fire, to display ritual power, to persuade the people with fervor. Only when their efforts ended would Elijah step forward with his solitary prayer. It was an audacious arrangement, but it carried an unspoken assurance. Truth had nothing to fear from delay. The longer Baal remained silent, the more thunderous Yahweh's answer would be. So the rules were set, the people satisfied, the altars soon to rise. The mountain became a waiting stage, every stone and tree holding its breath. Fire would decide, and when it fell, Israel would have no excuse left for limping between gods. The first bull was chosen, cut, and laid upon the altar of Baal. Wood was stacked neatly beneath it, dry branches ready to catch flame. With confidence brimming, the prophets of Baal began their work at dawn. Their voices rose in unison, a chorus of chants rolling across Mount Carmel, invoking their God with every sacred title they knew. The crowd leaned in, expectant, for this was the moment when fire from heaven should have answered. At first, the prophets' voices were steady, measured, the tone of men accustomed to ritual. They circled the altar, swaying in rhythm, their chants punctuated by cries of, "O Baal, answer us." The morning light glimmered on their fine garments and bronze amulets, the pageantry of religion on full display. But the altar remained silent, the wood unlit, the sacrifice untouched. As the hours passed, their voices grew louder, more desperate. They leapt around the altar, their movements wild, their dance spiraling into frenzy. Dust rose beneath their stamping feet as they shouted until their throats were raw. Still, the sky remained a hard, unbroken blue, the silence above mocking every word below. In their desperation, they turned to blood. Drawing knives from their belts, they slashed their arms and legs, red lines staining their robes. They cut deeper, hoping that their pain would stir their God, that their blood mingling with dust might provoke fire from the heavens. The people watched uneasily as the prophets staggered in exhaustion, their bodies trembling, their chants collapsing into hoarse cries. What had begun as confidence was unraveling into chaos, spectacle without substance. From morning until noon they cried, but no voice answered, no fire fell. The altar stood as it had before, wood dry, sacrifice cold. Their ritual had filled the mountain with noise, but the heavens gave no reply. The silence itself became deafening, a judgment greater than words. The people shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed to watch men degrade themselves before an unresponsive idol. Others still clung to hope, whispering that perhaps Baal delayed, that perhaps he would answer in the next moment. But the longer the prophets raged, the more hollow their performance appeared. By midday they were drenched in sweat, streaked with blood, staggering in exhaustion. Their chants faltered, their dances slowed, yet still they pressed on, unwilling to admit defeat. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until even the most loyal could not deny it. The god of storm and fire had nothing to give. The altar of Baal remained cold, while the crowd's hunger for certainty only grew sharper. The morning ritual had ended not in fire, but in failure. By noon the mountain rang with exhaustion rather than triumph. The prophets of Baal, their garments stained with blood, their voices ragged, continued to stagger around the lifeless altar. The crowd had grown restless, their expectant silence now tinged with unease. It was then that Elijah stepped forward, his eyes sharp, his tone cutting through the chaos like a knife through brittle wood. "Cry louder," he called, his voice carrying across the slopes with the sting of irony. "He is a god, isn't he? Perhaps he is deep in thought, or perhaps he has gone aside. The words dripped with mockery, suggesting with holy sarcasm that Baal might be preoccupied, or even relieving himself. The people gasped at the boldness, but Elijah pressed on. Maybe he is on a journey, or perhaps he sleeps and must be awakened. His taunts, laced with humor and contempt, pierced deeper than the prophet's knives. They had been shouting all morning, but now their cries rose to a frenzy, driven less by devotion than by desperation to prove Elijah wrong. They screamed louder, leaping higher, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The priests cut themselves afresh, blood running freely, staining the altar stones, a grotesque parody of sacrifice. Yet still the heavens remained silent, the blue dome above them unmoved. The people watched, some laughing uneasily at Elijah's jests, others wincing at the sight of the frenzied priests. What had begun as a solemn contest was turning into a farce, and Elijah's words exposed the emptiness of it all. His mockery was not cruelty but strategy, forcing the crowd to see what their silence had long concealed. Baal could not answer, because Baal was not there. The prophets staggered on, heedless of their own wounds, their chants dissolving into incoherent shrieks. Dust rose beneath their frantic leaps. The sun beat down mercilessly, and still no fire came. Their altar was nothing but a pile of dry wood and bloody stone, untouched by flame. The louder they cried, the clearer their impotence became. Elijah's sarcasm echoed in the ears of the people. Each word underscored the futility of what they witnessed. Their god of storm had no voice. Their god of fire could not kindle a single spark. Their god of power lay silent while his priests bled themselves dry. By mid-afternoon the prophets were spent, their frenzy collapsing into weakness. They fell around the altar like broken reeds, unable to stir even pity from the watching crowd. Elijah's laughter had done its work. Baal's silence was no longer ambiguous, it was absolute. The mountain waited, the people waited, and the lone prophet of Yahweh stood unshaken, ready at last to call upon the God who answered. The hours dragged on, the sun climbing high and pouring its relentless heat over Mount Carmel. What had begun with the proud chants of Baal's prophets had dissolved into chaos, and now into something worse, desperation without hope. The priests lay sprawled around their altar, their robes soaked with sweat and blood, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Knives slipped from limp hands, their cuts no longer ritual but wounds that would scar if they lived to see another day. Their cries, once loud and defiant, had thinned into hoarse murmurs, swallowed by the stillness of the air. The altar of Baal stood untouched, wood dry as bone, the bull's flesh stiffening under the sun. No smoke rose, no spark flickered. The silence was heavier than the shouts that had preceded it, a silence that mocked the priests more than Elijah's taunts ever could. It was the silence of absence, the emptiness of calling to a God who could not hear because he was not there. The crowd shifted uneasily, their restlessness betraying what their lips would not admit. Some had come expecting spectacle, eager to see Baal's fire streak across the sky. Others had clung to habit, too afraid to forsake the gods of Jezebel's court. But with every passing hour, the truth pressed harder. No matter how loud the prophets cried, no matter how deep they cut themselves, no answer came. The God who promised storms and fire had no power even to light his own altar. Ahab watched from his place of honor, his face darkening as the failure became undeniable. To admit it aloud would be to weaken his throne, to discredit Jezebel's priests, to confess that his kingdom's chosen God had no voice. Yet he, too, could not escape the silence. The famine that had wasted his land was echoed now in the lifeless altar before him. The priests, refusing to yield, stumbled back to their feet. With bloodied arms they renewed their dance, circling the altar as though motion itself might spark flame. They shouted until their voices broke, screamed until only gasps emerged. Some collapsed, their strength gone, while others clutched the stones of the altar, as if holding it tightly could force Baal to act. But nothing changed. Their god remained mute. By the time the sun began its slow descent, the futility was clear. Israel had waited from morning until evening, and all they had seen was blood and silence. The priests had given everything, their bodies broken in devotion, yet the heavens had withheld even the smallest ember. The mountain was quiet now, a heavy quiet that pressed down on the people's hearts. They had watched their prophets beg, bleed, and fail, and in that silence, a question louder than fire filled the air. If Baal could not answer, who then would? As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with tired light, Elijah stepped forward at last. The prophets of Baal had collapsed in a heap of exhaustion, their voices spent, their altar cold. The people, wearied by hours of watching, turned their eyes toward the lone prophet who now carried the weight of the moment. He did not shout, nor did he dance. Instead, he bent to the ground and began to gather stones. There was an altar of Yahweh on Carmel once, but it had been broken down, neglected in the years of compromise. Elijah set himself to rebuild it, not with haste but with deliberate care, each movement heavy with meaning. He chose 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. Though the kingdom itself was divided, though the people had long forgotten their unity under the covenant, by placing them together, he reminded them who they were meant to be, one people, bound not by throne or dynasty, but by their God. The crowd watched in silence as the rough stones took shape, a humble altar rising against the backdrop of Baal's elaborate platform. There was no polish, no decoration, no ornate carvings to dazzle the eye, only 12 unhewn stones, ancient and strong, carrying the memory of a God who had brought them out of Egypt, led them through wilderness, and planted them in this land. The simplicity itself became its own testimony, as though Yahweh needed no adornment to prove his power. When the stones were set, Elijah dug a trench around the altar, deep enough to hold water. He placed wood upon the stones, then laid the chosen bull carefully on top. Every action was calm, measured, in sharp contrast to the frenzy that had filled the mountain all day. His stillness itself seemed to call the people back to memory, to the old ways when Yahweh was their only God. The prophets of Baal lay in silence, their eyes dulled by defeat. Ahab watched, his expression tense, though he said nothing. The people leaned closer, drawn by the quiet authority in Elijah's work. Here was no spectacle of blood, no frantic attempt to seize divine attention. Here was faith steady enough to trust that Yahweh would answer without shouting. By repairing the altar, Elijah was doing more than preparing for fire. He was repairing the covenant itself, lifting broken stones into place as a sign that the people could be whole again if they returned to their God. The mountain grew hushed, even the evening wind pausing as if to witness. When Elijah stood back from the completed altar, the people saw not just stones and wood, but a reminder of who they had been and who they might yet become. The stage was set not for frenzy, but for revelation. Elijah's altar stood ready, rough stone stacked with careful purpose, wood laid in order, the bull prepared for sacrifice. Yet the prophet did not step back to pray. Instead, he raised his voice to the crowd and gave a command that must have sounded absurd in the parched land. "Fill 4 jars with water," he said, "and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." Water was precious beyond measure. Streams had dried, cisterns were nearly empty, and the people had carried what little remained up the mountain in skins and jars. To pour it out on an altar seemed wasteful, reckless even, but Elijah insisted, and men obeyed, carrying the jars and tipping them over the sacrifice. Cool rivulets ran down the bull's sides, soaking the wood, dripping between the stones. Again he spoke, "Do it a second time." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but they obeyed. Water cascading once more, darkening the wood until it gleamed. The trench Elijah had dug began to fill, the ground beneath the altar turning to mud. Still, he was not finished. "Do it a third time," he commanded. And again they came, emptying the jars until the sacrifice was drenched, the trench overflowing, water spilling out as though mocking fire itself. 3 times the jars were poured, and by the end no one could doubt the impossibility of what Elijah had set before them. Wood, that wet, would never burn. An altar so saturated was a defiance of natural law. If fire came now, it could not be trickery, nor accident, nor the work of human hands. It would be unmistakably divine. The people drew closer, compelled by the strangeness of it. Their hunger, their thirst, their silence, everything focused on the drenched altar. The prophets of Baal, exhausted and bloodied, looked on with hollow eyes, their own failure magnified by Elijah's confidence. Ahab shifted uneasily, for he could see that the prophet was removing any chance of doubt. The water glistened in the fading sunlight, a mirror that caught the colors of the evening sky. It seemed almost to laugh at the idea of flame. Yet this was the point. Elijah was not merely preparing a sacrifice. He was sealing a testimony. When fire fell, as he believed it would, no one could say it was coincidence or trickery. All Israel would know that Yahweh alone had answered. The mountain hushed. The drenched altar stood in the center, stones wet, wood dripping, flesh gleaming, trench brimming with water. Against all reason, against every law of nature, Elijah had prepared the stage. The harder the test, the clearer the answer would be. Now all waited to see whether heaven itself would break its silence. Evening shadows stretched across the slopes of Carmel when Elijah stepped toward the drenched altar. The crowd pressed in, silent now. The frenzy of Baal's prophets, a memory swallowed by exhaustion. Before them stood a sacrifice impossible to ignite, wood dripping, stones slick, the trench brimming with water. Elijah lifted his face, and where the prophets of Baal had shouted and danced and bled, he simply prayed. His voice was calm, carrying not desperation but quiet confidence. "O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, his words echoing the covenant that bound heaven and earth together. He called not on novelty but on memory, the God who had chosen, delivered, and named a people. "Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word." No elaborate incantations followed, no self-mutilation, no frantic attempt to stir divine attention. The prayer was brief, almost startling in its simplicity. Elijah asked for nothing to magnify himself. He sought only that the people would see and know. "Answer me, O Yahweh," he said. "Answer me, that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." The words hung in the air, carried by the stillness of the mountain. It was not length that gave them weight, but their truth. The God of Abraham needed no persuasion, no spectacle. The covenant stood firm even when Israel faltered. Elijah's prayer reminded them all. The drought, the famine, even this contest, were not random events, but God's call to bring his people back to himself. The crowd listened, stunned by the contrast. Hours of noise had failed to rouse Baal, yet this quiet invocation seemed to thrum with unseen power. Ahab shifted uneasily on his seat. Jezebel's prophets lay silent in defeat, and Israel's people leaned forward, hearts pounding. It was as though the mountain itself held its breath. Elijah lowered his head, his prayer complete. No more words were needed. He had not asked for fire to vindicate himself, but for God to reveal his own glory. The silence stretched, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, trembling, waiting. In that moment the altar stood as more than stones and wood. It was the nation's broken covenant rebuilt, their wandering hearts called home. Elijah's prayer had placed everything in Yahweh's hands, and the people knew it. The next instant would decide not only the contest on Carmel but the fate of their faith. The prophet's words had ended. Now heaven would answer. The prayer had barely left Elijah's lips when the mountain erupted in flame. No spark rose from hidden tinder. No lightning split the sky in coincidence. A fire descended, fierce and sudden, falling from heaven itself. It struck the altar with a roar that silenced every whisper, and in an instant the impossible became reality. The wood, soaked through with water, ignited as though dry as desert brush. The sacrifice vanished in the blaze, consumed before the crowd could draw breath. The flames leapt higher, curling around the stones themselves, until even the altar cracked and melted under the fury. The water in the trench hissed, steam rising in a white cloud, and then it was gone, licked away, as if it had never been. Nothing remained but scorched earth and a smoking hollow where moments earlier a drenched sacrifice had stood. The people gasped, then fell silent, their eyes wide with terror and awe. No priest's chant, no prophet's dance had accomplished this. Here was power that needed no coaxing, no human blood to stir it. Yahweh had answered, not with whispers, but with fire fierce enough to consume everything. The contrast with Baal's silence was absolute. Where Baal had offered nothing, Yahweh had given flame that devoured wood, stone, and water alike. Elijah stood motionless, his cloak stirring in the heat, his face reflecting the light of the blaze. He had asked for nothing more than for Israel to know their God, and the answer came with a clarity that no one could deny. The fire left no room for ambiguity, no chance for clever explanations. This was not a trick, nor a natural event. It was judgment and revelation, swift and absolute. The crowd could not remain standing. One by one, they fell to the ground, faces pressed into the dust, voices rising in unison. Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. The cry echoed across the slopes. Not the muttering of divided hearts, but the roar of a people confronted with truth. Their indecision had been burned away as thoroughly as the water and stones. They saw now who had answered, who had always been their God. The prophets of Baal stared, hollow and broken, their silence deeper than before. Their blood had stained the earth in vain. Their God had remained absent. All their spectacle had crumbled before a single prayer and a single flame. As smoke drifted upward into the darkening sky, Carmel itself seemed to testify. The mountain had become altar, the fire its witness. Israel had seen with their eyes what they had long forgotten in their hearts. The covenant God was still alive, still present, still Lord of heaven and earth, and his fire had fallen to remind them. The blaze still crackled on the stones when the cry began, faint at first, as though a single voice trembled into the silence. Then another joined, and another, until the sound spread like wind over dry grass. Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. The words rolled down the slopes of Carmel, carried on every tongue, shouted from every throat. It was not the polished chorus of ritual, but the raw outpouring of a people undone. Men who had bowed at Baal's altars fell face first in the dust, tears streaking their cheeks. Women who had whispered prayers to idols clutched their children and cried aloud to the covenant God. Elders lifted trembling hands, remembering the stories of their fathers, the deliverance from Egypt, the thunder at Sinai. For years those memories had been dim, buried beneath Jezebel's temples and Ahab's compromises. Now the fire had burned them back into living flame. The mountain thundered not with storm, but with repentance. The crowd's voices overlapped and surged, no longer hesitant, no longer limping between gods. They declared what their silence had denied. Yahweh alone was Lord. The sound was not rehearsed, not commanded by prophet or king. It rose from within, a flood of confession released at last. Even Ahab, seated in his royal place, could not disguise the weight pressing on him. His face hardened, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He had seen fire fall, had heard his people cry. The power of Jezebel's priests lay in ruins, their altar cold, their god exposed as nothing. The king who had married Tyre's daughter for strength now stood before a people who had remembered their true allegiance. Elijah did not shout over them. He simply stood, his head bowed, as though receiving their cries as an offering not to himself but to the God he served. His task had never been to win followers, but to turn hearts. And now, on the very mountain where Baal's prophets had cut themselves in vain, the nation bent itself before Yahweh once more. Children repeated the words as though learning them for the first time. Yahweh, He is God. The phrase became more than a confession. It was a rediscovery, the reclaiming of a forgotten truth. Their repentance was not polished theology, but raw surrender, a nation undone by fire and silence, remade by revelation. The mountain carried the cry like thunder, echoing from ridge to ridge, as though creation itself joined in. The same earth that had been starved of rain, the same sky that had withheld its clouds, now bore witness to the covenant renewed. In the sound of the people's voices, the famine of faith was broken. Israel had remembered its God, and the mountain roared with their confession. The cry of the people still echoed on the slopes when Elijah's voice rose above it, sharp and commanding. "Seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape." The crowd, newly awakened, surged forward with sudden zeal. Fear and fury mingled in their faces as they rushed upon the priests who only moments before had strutted with confidence. The same people who had once watched them in awe now dragged them down with rough hands, binding them in ropes or with strips torn from their own garments. The proud prophets, painted with blood from their rituals, now trembled as captives. Elijah led the procession down the mountain toward the Wadi Kishon, the dry riverbed that had seen battles before in Israel's history. There, with the fire of God still burning in memory and the smell of smoke clinging to the air, the crowd turned executioner. What followed was not measured justice as a court might deliver, but a holy war moment, swift and uncompromising. Steel flashed, stones struck, cries rose and were swallowed by the valley. The prophets of Baal, who had cut themselves in frenzied devotion, now met death at the hands of the people they had misled. The riverbed became a place of reckoning. For years, Jezebel's priests had eaten at the queen's table, had strutted in robes of power, had mocked Yahweh's prophets and hunted them into caves. Now their end was as sudden as it was total. The Kishon, once dry, ran red as though rain had come in blood before water. Some among the people hesitated at the violence, but the memory of drought, of children starving, of fields cracked and barren hardened their hearts. They remembered the silence of Baal, the fire that consumed even water, and their resolve grew fierce. To leave these prophets alive would be to invite the old bondage back. The choice was not between mercy and cruelty, but between cleansing and corruption. Ahab watched, pale, his authority slipping with every fallen priest. He had once thought Jezebel's gods would secure his throne. Now he saw them silenced, their servants struck down at the edge of his own land. He gave no command to stop it, for the people would not have listened. Their zeal was no longer his; to control it belonged to the God who had answered by fire. When the slaughter was finished, silence fell heavy over the Kishon. The priests lay still, their voices ended, their power broken. The people stood breathing hard, their garments stained, their faces set. They had not only witnessed Yahweh's fire, they had enacted his judgment. What had begun on Carmel in flame was sealed in blood below. The prophets of Baal were no more, and Israel had turned from divided silence to decisive action. The fire had fallen, the people had cried. The prophets of Baal lay silent by the Kishon, yet the land remained parched, the sky still a dome of bronze. Elijah turned his steps upward, climbing the rugged slopes of Carmel toward its peak. He went not to revel in triumph, but to bend low in prayer. For though judgment had come, mercy was still withheld, and without rain the land would remain under the shadow of famine. At the summit he crouched to the ground, his face between his knees, the posture of one emptied of all strength but filled with faith. Alone he could not summon clouds, but he knew the God who withheld rain could also release it. Close by stood his servant, the silent witness to Elijah's hidden work. "Go up now," the prophet said softly. "Look toward the sea." The servant obeyed, climbing a little higher to peer across the endless horizon. The Mediterranean stretched vast and empty, blue upon blue, without a wisp of cloud. "There is nothing," he reported. Elijah did not rise, did not falter. "Go again," he said. Once more the servant looked. Once more the sky offered nothing. Again Elijah prayed, his body pressed low, his lips moving in quiet insistence. A third time the servant returned with empty words, then a fourth, then a fifth, then a sixth. Each time the answer was the same: nothing. Yet Elijah remained bowed, laboring in prayer as if wrestling the heavens themselves. At last, on the seventh watch, the servant's voice trembled with something new. "Behold," he said, "a little cloud, as small as a man's hand, is rising from the sea." To any other eye it was nothing, a smudge on the horizon barely worth notice. But to Elijah it was enough. He lifted his head, strength surging in his frame. "Go," he told the servant. "Say to Ahab, prepare your chariot, and go down, lest the rain stop you." The sky that had been brass began to shift. The small cloud grew, its edges swelling, multiplying, merging with others until the western horizon darkened. A wind rose from the sea, carrying the scent of water long withheld. The people still gathered at Carmel felt the change in the air, the hush before storm. From prayer to cloud to storm, Elijah's persistence had drawn mercy down. The heavens that had once withheld now gathered their waters. Soon, rain would come, not a drizzle, but a torrent. The drought was ending, and Israel would taste again the faithfulness of the God they had nearly forgotten. On Carmel's peak, the prophet who prayed fire into flame now prayed water into flood, and heaven answered once more. The servant's words seemed almost laughable against the vast horizon, a cloud no larger than a man's hand. After years of empty skies, such a speck looked insignificant, hardly worth mention. Yet Elijah rose at once, his eyes alight, as though he had heard the rumble of a storm within that tiny wisp. For him, the small cloud was not weakness but promise, the first note of a song long withheld. The people on the mountain craned their necks, some squinting into the distance, others shaking their heads. Could that faint smudge truly mean the drought was ending? But Elijah understood the ways of God, who delights in beginnings too small for human pride to claim. It had been so with Abraham, called from barrenness to father nations. It had been so with Moses, whose staff split seas. It would be so again, the great storm announced by a mere hand-sized cloud. The symbolism was plain. The drought had not broken through the power of armies, nor through the wealth of kings, nor through the rituals of Baal's priests. It would break with a sign so small it might be missed by eyes too hardened to hope. The cloud rising from the sea carried a quiet rebuke to Israel's obsession with spectacle. God had answered in fire that consumed stone and water, but he also answered in subtle beginnings, where faith was tested not by sight of abundance but by trust in a sliver of promise. The hand-shaped cloud itself whispered of divine presence. Just as Yahweh's hand had led Israel from Egypt, just as his hand had written the covenant on stone, so now his hand rose again in the sky, signaling mercy. From the sea, the symbol of chaos, of nations, of forces beyond human control, emerged the first sign of restoration. What had been feared as hostile now became the vessel of blessing. Elijah's command to Ahab revealed his confidence. Harness your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. To prepare for flood at the sight of a speck was to act in faith, to trust that God's promises do not falter once begun. The king, still stunned from the fire on Carmel, obeyed without argument, sensing that this prophet saw further than any horizon. The sky darkened swiftly, as if the hand of God were spreading across the heavens, pulling veils of cloud into place. The wind picked up, carrying coolness long forgotten, the taste of rain already on the air. What began as nothing more than a servant's faint report now grew into a storm that would drench the land and prove once again that Yahweh alone commanded creation. The cloud, the size of a hand, was not small at all. It was the measure of divine power hidden in humility, of beginnings that swell into fulfillment. From little, much. From silence, a storm. From drought, an outpouring. What Israel saw that day was not only rain, but the God who works wonders from the smallest signs. The sky that had hung like bronze over Israel for 3.5 years began to soften. The small cloud on the horizon spread and thickened, joined by others, dark upon dark, until the western sky was clothed in gathering shadow. The wind shifted, cool and insistent, carrying with it the heavy scent of rain. For a moment, the people on Carmel stood in stunned silence, watching as the heavens that had refused them now prepared to pour out blessing. Then the first drops fell. They came slowly at first, fat and heavy, splattering dust into mud. A murmur rippled through the crowd, astonishment, relief, disbelief mingled into one. Children lifted their faces to the sky, laughing as the long-forgotten touch of water struck their skin. Farmers wept openly, their cracked lips trembling as the parched earth began to drink. The drizzle swelled into sheets, and the sheets into torrents. The heavens opened with a roar, and rain hammered the mountainside as though all the years of withheld water had been stored up for this moment. Valleys became rivers in an instant, streams leapt back to life, and dry gullies thundered with rushing floods. The land groaned with joy as thirst gave way to renewal. Fields that had lain barren and brittle now softened, ready once more for seed. Wells that had been scraped to dust began to fill. Trees lifted drooping branches to the downpour, their leaves quivering under the weight of blessing. The curse of drought was broken, and the earth itself seemed to breathe again. Ahab hurried in his chariot, wheels sinking in the sodden ground, horses straining against the deluge. Behind him, the storm followed, a living wall of cloud and water, swallowing all in its path. The king had witnessed fire. Now he fled before water, unable to deny that both answered to the word of the prophet. Elijah stood on the mountain as the rain fell, his cloak clinging to his shoulders, his hair plastered to his brow. He did not flinch at the storm's violence, for this was no chaos but covenant mercy. Where fire had revealed God's judgment, water now revealed his compassion. The same God who consumed the altar had not abandoned his people. He had remembered them, turning hearts back through fire and now refreshing them through flood. The land of Israel, cracked and broken, drank deeply of the torrents. The sound of Baal's silence was gone, drowned out by the thunder of Yahweh's answer. The storm was not merely weather, it was a declaration. Life had returned. The covenant still held. The God who answered by fire was also the God who gave rain. The storm raged over Carmel, lightning flaring across the darkened sky, rain lashing in torrents that turned paths into rivers. Ahab's chariot strained forward, horses plunging through mud as the king fled toward Jezreel. Yet even in the chaos, another figure emerged. Elijah, the prophet who had summoned both fire and rain. As the clouds split with thunder, he gathered his cloak about his waist and began to run. It was no ordinary sprint. The hand of Yahweh came upon him, filling his body with a strength not his own. Feet that had walked in wilderness and stood still in prayer now carried him faster than the royal chariot. Through sheets of rain and over sodden earth, Elijah ran, not in defiance of the king, but before him, a solitary herald cutting the path. Lightning lit his form, a lone runner in the storm, swift as wind, tireless as fire. The sight was heavy with meaning. Prophets did not ordinarily serve kings, and Elijah had been Ahab's fiercest critic. Yet now he ran ahead of him, like a servant clearing the way, like a banner-bearer for Israel's monarch. It was a symbolic act, a reminder that even flawed rulers remained under God's order, and that the prophet's role was not to overthrow the throne but to call it back into covenant faithfulness. Elijah, by running before Ahab, showed that Yahweh still desired to lead king and nation if only they would follow. Ahab must have seen him through the curtain of rain, the prophet's figure bounding before the horses. What did the king feel in that moment? Triumph, that the drought had ended at last. Fear, remembering the fire that had consumed the altar. Resentment, that his enemy now ran as his herald. Or perhaps a flicker of recognition that Yahweh's word had proven true, and that his own survival depended on the prophet who went before him. The people who later heard the story remembered more than a chase through storm. They saw in Elijah's run a living parable. The prophet leading the king, the word of God preceding the power of men, the servant of heaven, showing the true path for earthly rule. For a fleeting moment, Israel's monarchy and prophecy moved in tandem, the king in his chariot, the prophet running before him, both driven by the same storm of divine mercy. The rain poured harder, soaking cloak and crown alike, blurring the lines between ruler and subject, between palace and wilderness. And still Elijah ran, tireless, unstoppable, as though carried by the storm itself. His act was not merely speed but symbol. A prophet leading the way, a king following behind, and above them both the God who sent rain after fire. News of Carmel raced faster than any chariot. By the time Ahab reached Jezreel, soaked and weary from the storm, the tale of fire and slaughter was already forming in whispers among the people. Yet when the king entered the palace and poured out the story before his queen, Jezebel did not tremble. She listened, her painted eyes fixed on him, her jaw hard. Fire from heaven, the people's cry. The prophets of Baal struck down. It was a tale meant to humble. Instead it filled her with fury. She rose from her throne, the storm outside echoing the tempest within. To Ahab she said little, for she knew her husband's heart bent like reeds in the wind. But to Elijah she sent a message sharp as steel. So may the gods do to me, and more also, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life as the life of one of them whom you have slain. It was not mere anger. It was a vow, an oath sealed by the gods she served, dripping with the venom of insulted power. Elijah had faced kings without flinching, stood alone against hundreds of priests, prayed fire and rain into being. Yet when Jezebel's threat reached him, it pierced deeper than swords. The queen's words carried more than human malice. They carried the weight of relentless defiance, the refusal to yield even after undeniable proof. For all the triumph of Carmel, here was a reminder that one victory did not end the war. Baal's worship still had a throne in Israel, seated in Jezebel's heart. The prophet's spirit faltered. Perhaps he had expected Ahab to repent, the queen to yield, the nation to return fully to covenant faith. Instead, he found himself hunted again, his triumph soured by the persistence of evil. Jezebel's threat was more than personal. It was a declaration that Baal's struggle was not finished, that Israel's battle for its soul would continue. In the palace, Jezebel plotted with cold precision. She had lost 400 prophets in a single day, yet her will was unbroken. If fire from heaven could not turn her, she would answer with blood. Her defiance embodied the depth of Israel's rebellion, the hardness of heart that no sign could soften. Where the people had cried, "Yahweh, He is God," Jezebel raised her own cry, "Elijah must die." The rain pounded outside, washing the land, softening the soil, renewing the earth. But inside Jezreel's palace, a darker resolve hardened. The storm of mercy had not reached Jezebel's spirit. And so Elijah, who had seen heaven's fire and storm, now faced the fury of a queen whose vengeance would drive him into the wilderness. Elijah fled. The same man who had outrun Ahab's chariot now stumbled southward with none of the fire that once filled his steps. The queen's words rang in his ears, sharper than the rain that had lashed his face on Carmel. Each mile carried him farther from Jezreel, farther from the palace, farther from the people who had shouted Yahweh's name yet bowed still to fear. He crossed Judah's border, where Ahab's rule held no sway, but even there his spirit found no rest. At last he dismissed his servant and went alone into the wilderness. The desert stretched before him, silent and merciless, its stones unyielding, its horizon endless. Each step grew heavier, until his legs trembled and his chest heaved with weariness. He who had called down fire now felt nothing but ash within himself. Beneath the hard sun, despair pressed down more heavily than heat. He came to a broom tree, a low, sparse shelter in the emptiness. There he collapsed, his body folding into the dust. He pulled his cloak tight around him and whispered a prayer that was no prayer at all, but surrender. It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life. I am no better than my fathers. His words carried the weight of exhaustion, disappointment, and the bitter taste of futility. He had thought Carmel would turn the nation back. He had thought fire and rain would seal the covenant. Yet Jezebel's voice still thundered louder than repentance. Elijah lay in the dust, a prophet undone. His victories seemed like mirages, vanishing in the heat of present failure. Alone under the thin shadow of the broom tree, he felt smaller than ever before. A single figure against the endless desert, a weary man who no longer wished to walk the path set before him. Sleep overcame him at last, not the rest of peace, but the collapse of a soul emptied of strength. In that wilderness, far from kings and crowds, Elijah revealed the frailty hidden within even the mightiest prophet. He had faced storms and altars, but he could not face the unyielding defiance of a heart like Jezebel's. His cry beneath the broom tree was the cry of every servant who feels abandoned in their labor, every voice that has shouted truth into silence and heard only the echo of futility. The desert lay still around him, its silence broken only by the slow rise and fall of his breath. Elijah had run until he could run no more, and beneath the broom tree he offered himself not as prophet, not as victor, but as weary flesh longing for release. There, in the emptiness of wilderness despair, the man of fire and rain waited for God or for death. Elijah slept beneath the broom tree, his body slack with exhaustion, his spirit crumpled with despair. He had prayed for death, but instead of silence a touch stirred him awake. Not the harsh grip of a soldier come to seize him, but the gentle press of a hand. He blinked, expecting emptiness, and saw beside him a cake of bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water glistening with dew. No voice thundered, no vision blazed, only the quiet provision of food where none should exist. "Arise and eat," said the messenger, his words soft as morning. Elijah obeyed without thought, eating the bread, drinking the water. Warmth spread through him, not merely from food but from the presence that lingered in the air. When he had finished, sleep overcame him again, heavy and irresistible. A second time the angel returned, touching him with the same tenderness, as though to remind the prophet that heaven had not forgotten him even in the wilderness. "Arise and eat," came the words again, "for the journey is too great for you." Elijah looked once more and found fresh bread, fresh water. This was no ordinary sustenance. It was food that bore strength beyond its weight, the kind of nourishment that carried a soul as well as a body. He ate, he drank, and in the silence knew that God's answer to his despair was not death but provision. The wilderness lay before him, stretching barren and endless, yet Elijah found himself walking into it. 40 days and 40 nights he went on, guided not by his own will but by the strength of that bread. Each step carried him deeper into the silence, away from Jezebel's threats, away from the cries of Carmel, away from the noise of kings and altars and crowds. The desert became his companion, and the memory of fire and rain faded into the rhythm of footsteps sustained by heavenly food. This was no hurried flight, but a pilgrimage. 40 days recalled Israel's 40 years, their wandering sustained by manna. Elijah walked in their pattern, another prophet fed by bread from heaven, learning again that life does not come from strength or triumph, but from every gift God chooses to give. The broom tree had been his place of collapse. Now the path became his place of renewal. By the time he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, Elijah was no longer the broken man who had begged for death. He was still weary, still searching, but alive, sustained not by his own resolve but by bread and water placed beside him in the dust. Heaven had not thundered at his despair. It had answered with food, reminding the prophet that sometimes the holiest miracle is simply enough strength for the next step. Elijah reached Horeb, the mountain of God, weary from his 40-day journey, yet drawn by something deeper than exhaustion. He found a cave in the rock, a hollow that offered shelter from the desert winds, and there he settled, waiting for the God who had once spoken from this same mountain to Moses in thunder and flame. Night fell heavy, and in the silence he nursed his question. What was left for a prophet whose words had failed to turn the hearts of a nation? At dawn the word came, sharp and searching. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The question pierced him, not as accusation, but as invitation to speak his despair. "I have been very zealous for the Lord," he replied, his voice hoarse with weariness. "But the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets. I alone am left, and they seek my life also." His words spilled out as lament, the cry of one who had borne fire and storm but felt abandoned in the aftermath. Then the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before me." Elijah stepped toward the mouth of the cave, and the mountain shook. First came a wind so fierce it tore at the rocks, splitting them, hurling dust into the air like a living beast. Elijah braced himself, but the voice of God was not in the wind. Then the ground heaved in violent quake, the stone beneath him groaning as if creation itself might split apart. Still the voice was absent. Fire followed, bright and consuming, rushing across the ridges in roaring waves of heat. Elijah shielded his face. Yet the fire, too, carried no divine word. When the fury ended, there was silence, and into that silence came a sound so slight it was more felt than heard, a whisper, a gentle murmur like breath. Elijah drew his cloak across his face and stepped forward, trembling. For here, not in storm or quake or flame, the presence of God spoke. The same God who had thundered at Sinai now revealed himself in stillness, reminding his prophet that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the whisper is stronger than fire. Again the voice asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And again the prophet poured out his lament, but this time the despair carried differently, softened by the whisper's nearness. God did not rebuke him for his fear, nor dismiss his weariness. Instead, he gave him new purpose: anoint kings, find your successor, continue the work. Elijah was not alone. The story was not ended. 7,000 in Israel had not bowed to Baal. The whisper assured him that the covenant was not broken, that God's ways were not exhausted by spectacle. On Horeb, Elijah learned what fire and rain had not taught, that the God of Israel speaks not only in power that rends the earth, but in the quiet that steadies a broken heart. The cave at Horeb was dark, its stone walls holding the chill of night. Elijah sat within it, his cloak wrapped tightly, his heart heavier than his body. He had seen fire fall from heaven, rain return to the land, and the people cry out Yahweh's name. Yet Jezebel still ruled, Baal's shadow lingered, and the prophet found himself alone in the wilderness, running not toward triumph but away from despair. When the voice came, it startled him by its gentleness. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The question struck deeper than command or rebuke. It was not thunderous, not wrapped in force, but piercing in its simplicity. Why indeed was he there? He had run until his legs failed, prayed for death beneath a broom tree, wandered 40 days sustained only by heaven's bread. And now here he was, not at Israel's altars, not before its people, but hidden in a cave. The prophet who once stood fearless before a king now crouched in shadows. Elijah answered with the fullness of his weariness, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. But the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek my life also." His words poured out like bitter water, brimming with loneliness and futility. He cast himself as the last faithful one, the solitary defender of covenant truth, abandoned by a nation deaf to fire, blind to rain. There was truth in his lament, yet also distortion. Elijah had seen hundreds of prophets slain, had watched Israel bow before Baal, had felt Jezebel's fury, but despair had narrowed his vision. He could not see the 7,000 who had not bent their knees, could not grasp that God's purposes were not undone by one queen's threat. His self-pity magnified his solitude until even the whisper of hope seemed absent. The divine question revealed more than it asked. It showed that God had not abandoned his prophet, that even in wilderness and cave, the voice still sought him out. "What are you doing here?" It was a summons back to calling, a reminder that the cave was not his dwelling place, nor despair his vocation. Elijah was weary, yes, but the mission was not over. The prophet's reply, raw and aching, was received without dismissal. God did not silence him for weakness, nor strike him for presumption. Instead, he listened, letting Elijah pour his grief into the stillness. For the God who answers by fire also answers by presence, allowing his servant to speak, even in complaint. The question remained hovering in the air, inviting Elijah to see himself not as forsaken but as found, not as the last, but as still chosen. In the cave of self-pity, the whisper of God carved a path back to purpose. The mountain had trembled. Wind tore through the rocks with a howl that seemed strong enough to unmake the world. The ground shook beneath Elijah's feet, a quake that split the stone as if to reveal the heart of creation itself. Fire followed, leaping and crackling across the ridges, fierce and dazzling, the kind of force that once lit Sinai and seared the memory of Israel. These were the signs Elijah expected: raw power, undeniable proof, heaven's might displayed in ways no mortal could resist. Yet in each one the prophet listened and found only emptiness. The Lord was not in the wind. The Lord was not in the earthquake. The Lord was not in the fire. And then came a sound so slight it might have been missed, a murmur barely more than silence. The text names it a gentle whisper, a still small voice, as though the breath of God passed close enough to brush the ear. Elijah felt it more than he heard it. He drew his cloak over his face, trembling not with fear of destruction but with awe at presence. For here, in quietness, God had spoken in a way more profound than storm. The lesson was unmistakable. Elijah had believed fire on Carmel would be enough. That spectacle would break Israel's indecision. That overwhelming displays would force repentance. But Jezebel still defied, and the people still wavered. Power alone had not turned hearts. Now on Horeb the prophet learned that God's ways were not bound to force. His kingdom moved in whispers as well as in fire, in gentle persistence rather than crushing spectacle. The whisper told Elijah what the earthquake could not: that God's strength is not threatened by human rebellion, nor measured by human awe. True power does not need to shout to be heard. It endures, reshapes, renews in ways quieter than storms, slower than fire, yet surer than either. Just as rain began with a cloud the size of a hand, so renewal would come through means as small as faithful voices, hidden prophets, ordinary obedience. For the prophet who longed for decisive victory, the whisper was humbling. It revealed that his despair had come from mistaking God's methods for his own expectations. Elijah thought he stood alone, bearing the full burden of covenant. But God's whisper reminded him that the work was larger than one man, unfolding in ways unseen, beyond his grasp yet secure in God's hand. On Horeb's heights, Elijah discovered that the Almighty does not always rend the skies to prove himself. Sometimes, he bends low, speaking softly, reshaping history through quiet faithfulness. The gentle voice of God carried more power than wind, quake, or fire. For it touched not just the earth, but the heart of a prophet, and set him once more on the path of calling. The journey down from Horeb carried Elijah not only away from the mountain but into new purpose. The whisper had spoken, and with it came instructions that stretched beyond his own lifetime. He was to anoint kings, to continue the struggle against Baal, and most striking of all, to find a successor. A prophet who had felt utterly alone was told to share his mantle, to pass on the fire that once seemed his alone to bear. In the fields of Abel-Meholah, Elijah found him. Elisha was plowing, 12 yoke of oxen straining across the soil, their breath steaming in the air as the heavy plow carved furrows into the earth. It was ordinary labor, the work of a farmer, steady and strong. But heaven had chosen this moment for interruption. Elijah approached in silence, his figure weathered by wilderness, his eyes still holding the reflection of Horeb's fire and whisper. Without a word, he cast his cloak across Elisha's shoulders. The act spoke louder than thunder. The cloak was more than fabric. It was the symbol of prophetic calling, the weight of vision and burden. Elisha froze as its rough folds touched him, the oxen still pulling forward until the plow jerked to a halt. In that instant, the soil of his field and the furrows of his life were split open, revealing a path he had never imagined. "Let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow you," Elisha said, his voice catching between duty and destiny. Elijah's reply was spare, almost distant. "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" The choice was his, not compelled, not forced. The cloak had been laid, but Elisha must decide whether to carry it. He did not linger. Elisha slaughtered his oxen, broke the wooden plow for firewood, and cooked the meat for the people to eat. It was farewell and offering all at once, the burning of bridges, the end of one life so another could begin. A farmer who had once fed the land now fed his village in a final act of generosity, then stepped forward into the unknown. Elisha followed Elijah, not as equal but as apprentice, servant before prophet. He would pour water on his master's hands, walk behind the man who had stood before kings, and learn what it meant to carry heaven's word into earth's turmoil. In the plowman turned prophet's disciple, the story took on new breath. Elijah's despair had whispered, "I alone am left." The cloak across Elisha's shoulders answered, "Not so." The call of Elisha was quiet compared to Carmel's fire, but no less powerful. It showed that God's work does not end with one voice, however mighty. The plowman became prophet in waiting, and the field became the threshold of a greater harvest. In the simple act of laying a cloak, the future of prophecy in Israel was secured. The drought had ended, but the storm over Israel's soul had not. Though fire had fallen on Carmel and the prophets of Baal had been struck down, Jezebel still ruled in Samaria, and Ahab still bent to her will. In the cities and villages, the worship of Baal did not vanish overnight. Temples still stood, priests still whispered their chants, and the queen's vengeance hunted any voice that dared cry the name of Yahweh too loudly. For the prophets of the covenant, exile became their portion. Some hid in caves, just as Obadiah had once sheltered them, sustained by secret networks of the faithful who smuggled bread and water by night. Others scattered into the wilderness, dwelling among the rocks and ravines, listening for word from God but hearing only the sounds of pursuit. A few fled across borders into Judah or beyond, carrying their testimony with them, their very presence a silent rebuke to the house of Omri. They lived as fugitives, yet they carried within them a fire that could not be extinguished. Their resistance was not marked by open battle but by survival. To remain alive, to keep memory of the covenant alive, was itself defiance against Jezebel's terror. In hidden gatherings, they recited the words of Torah, reminding one another that the God who once led their fathers through wilderness had not abandoned them now. In whispered prayers, they lifted their voices for Israel's repentance. Even when their numbers dwindled and their hopes dimmed, the land itself seemed divided. On the high places, shrines to Baal smoked with offerings, but in lonely households lamps were lit in Yahweh's name. Children were taught in secret that their God was not like Baal, not bound to rain or storm, but Lord of heaven and earth. Women remembered the stories of Sarah and Hannah, passing them down when official altars had been defiled. Farmers still brought firstfruits to hidden prophets, offering what little they had to sustain a remnant. It was a fragile resistance, lacking armies or banners, but it endured. For in every generation, God preserved a seed. Elijah had felt alone beneath the broom tree, yet unseen thousands had not bowed the knee to Baal. They lived in exile within their own land, but they lived still, and their faithfulness stitched together a fabric of hope that Jezebel's sword could not unravel. Prophets in exile embodied a truth larger than their hiding places, that divine purpose is never silenced by persecution. The whisper Elijah heard on Horeb echoed in their lives, quiet but unyielding, sustaining them against fear. They bore no fire from heaven, but they carried embers enough to keep covenant memory alive until the day would come when judgment fell on the house that sought their destruction. The palace at Samaria was rich with ivory and cedar, yet Ahab's eyes wandered toward something humbler. A vineyard close beside his summer house in Jezreel. Naboth the Jezreelite had tended it as his fathers before him, vines planted deep in ancestral soil, more than a field, a heritage. Ahab approached him with the polished tones of a king offering fairness. "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden," he said, promising either money or land in exchange. But Naboth shook his head. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." For Naboth, this was not a business deal but obedience to covenant law. Land was not merely property. It was a sacred trust. Ahab returned to his palace sullen, refusing food, his spirit restless not from hunger but from thwarted desire. Jezebel found him there, face to the wall like a sulking child. She scorned his weakness. Was he not king? Did power mean so little that one farmer could deny him? Her words dripped with contempt, but beneath them lay a chilling resolve. If the law stood in the way, she would twist it. If Naboth resisted, she would silence him. Letters went out in the king's name, sealed with his authority, but written with her will. Elders of Jezreel received them, men who should have upheld justice but instead trembled before the queen's command. They proclaimed a fast, a mockery of piety, and placed Naboth in a seat of honor. Then came false witnesses, declaring he had cursed God and the king, a crime demanding death. Stones flew, harsh and final, until Naboth lay still in the dust, his blood soaking the very soil he had refused to sell. When word reached Jezebel, she went to Ahab with triumph. "Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth," she said, as though the gift of death were a token of love. Ahab went down and claimed the land, his footsteps treading on injustice, his vegetables to grow where innocence had bled. But the vineyard did not lie silent. Its injustice cried louder than the prophets in hiding, and God heard. The same voice that had once asked Elijah on Horeb, "What are you doing here?" now sent him forth again, this time to confront a king in the stolen field. For Naboth's vineyard had become more than land. It was a symbol of Israel's corruption, the twisting of justice, the betrayal of covenant trust. in the shade of its vines. The story of Ahab and Jezebel darkened further. They had thought power could seize what law forbade, that falsehood could bury truth beneath stones. But Naboth's blood became a witness, and his vineyard a stage on which God's prophet would announce the downfall of a house built on injustice. The air over Jezreel was heavy when Elijah appeared once more before the king. Ahab had come down to Naboth's vineyard, not to mourn its former owner, but to measure his new possession. Tracing the lines where his vegetables would grow, the soil was still dark with the blood of the man who had refused to sell. Into that stolen field walked the prophet, silent at first, his presence alone enough to chill the air. Ahab looked up and his face fell. "Have you found me, O my enemy?" he muttered, knowing the answer before it came. "I have found you," Elijah replied, his voice steady, carrying the weight of judgment, "because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord." The words struck like hammer blows, not only naming Ahab's crime but exposing the heart that had bartered away covenant loyalty for power and desire. The prophet did not hesitate, for he spoke not his own bitterness but the sentence of God. "Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will bring disaster upon you. I will consume you. I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond, or free in Israel. I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, like the house of Baasha, because you have provoked me to anger and made Israel to sin." The cadence of doom rolled out, recalling the fates of kings who had come before, each swept away by divine judgment. Ahab's dynasty, for all its power and palaces, would not endure, nor was Jezebel spared. "The dogs shall eat Jezebel within the walls of Jezreel," Elijah declared. The image was brutal, unflinching. The queen who had mocked covenant law, who had orchestrated Naboth's death with forged letters and false witnesses, would herself be torn apart by creatures without conscience. The place where she had spilled blood would see her own dishonor. The field seemed to echo with the words. Soil meant to yield grapes and vegetables became the stage of prophecy, a reminder that the land itself testified against those who defiled it. Around them the sun beat down, but the shadow of doom stretched longer than any vine could cover. Ahab, once proud, now trembled at the certainty in Elijah's voice. He had called the prophet an enemy, but in truth Elijah was the mirror of his guilt, reflecting what Ahab had tried to ignore. The rebuke was not merely personal but national. The king's corruption had seeped into Israel's life, teaching the people to trade covenant inheritance for the whims of power. By pronouncing judgment on Ahab's house, Elijah pronounced judgment on a system built on injustice and idolatry. The doom was not Elijah's to soften or sharpen. It was the word of the Lord spoken in the vineyard of Naboth, carried on the voice of the prophet, sounding like thunder over the fragile pretenses of royal strength. When Elijah's words of doom fell upon Ahab, the king who had strutted through palaces and sulked like a child for vineyards, something broke within him. The prophet's voice had not been louder than fire or storm, but it struck deeper, echoing off the stones of Naboth's vineyard, heavy with guilt. Ahab's face drained of its royal pride. His garments, once fit for a throne, were torn in grief. He wrapped himself in sackcloth, the coarse fabric of penitence, and walked softly, his steps no longer those of a king claiming dominion but of a man bearing shame. Israel had rarely seen such a sight. The king who had bowed to Jezebel's will, who had erected altars for Baal and silenced prophets, now moved as one subdued. He did not summon armies, nor retaliate against Elijah. Instead, he fasted, he wept, he lowered himself. His remorse was imperfect, perhaps born more of fear than true turning, yet it was real enough to reach the ears of heaven. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah again, surprising even the prophet who had pronounced judgment with such certainty. "Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me?" God asked. The question bore both irony and mercy. The man who had led Israel astray now bent beneath the weight of divine sentence. His repentance was no grand revival, no sweeping reform. It was fragile, momentary, a flicker of humility in a heart long hardened. Yet God saw it, and God counted it. Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the disaster in his days, the Lord declared. In his son's days I will bring the disaster upon his house. Mercy came, not as pardon, but as delay. The judgment stood, yet its execution would fall later, giving Ahab space he had neither earned nor expected. Even in wrath, the covenant God revealed a patience that exceeded human vengeance. For a time, Ahab walked as a chastened man. His sackcloth marked him not as a ruler in splendor, but as a sinner spared. Israel's memory would hold this moment of brokenness, brief though it was, as a glimpse of how quickly the mighty can fall, and how swiftly God's ear bends toward contrition. Yet the pause in judgment did not erase the blood in Naboth's vineyard, nor the dogs that waited for Jezebel, nor the doom foretold for Omri's line. Ahab's humbling was a reminder that repentance, however flawed, can move the heart of God, but also that repentance without lasting change cannot avert justice forever. The mercy was temporary, the disaster postponed. In the soil of Jezreel, both sackcloth and prophecy lingered as signs, one of human frailty, the other of divine certainty. Ahab had bowed, but the storm still waited just beyond the horizon. The shadow of Naboth's vineyard had not yet lifted when Ahab turned his eyes northward. Aram Damascus, restless and ambitious, pressed against Israel's borders. Ben-Hadad, its king, gathered 32 vassal rulers with their horses and chariots, demanding silver, gold, wives, and children as tribute. Ahab, cowed by such force, at first agreed, but when the demands grew harsher, his pride stiffened. War was coming, and the king who had just bowed in sackcloth now reached for armor. Samaria braced itself for siege. Aram's armies swarmed like locusts across the valleys, their tents dotting the hillsides. Within the walls, Israel's defenders trembled, outnumbered and ill-equipped. Then a prophet unnamed, unadorned, came to Ahab with a message as startling as fire on Carmel. Thus says the Lord, have you seen this great multitude? Behold, I will give it into your hand this day, and you shall know that I am the Lord, not by strength of arms, nor by foreign allies, but by the word of Yahweh would victory be granted. The plan defied reason. The young officers of the provincial commanders were chosen to lead the charge, scarcely more than attendants. Yet when they marched out at noon, catching Ben-Hadad's army in drunken revelry, the tide turned. Aram's soldiers scattered, their king fleeing on horseback, and Israel tasted a triumph they had not expected. Still, the prophet returned with a sober word. Strengthen yourself, and mark well what you do, for at the turn of the year the king of Aram will come up against you again. But judgment still warned in the wings. True enough, the next spring, Ben-Hadad's forces returned. Their God is a God of the hills, the Aramean counselors said, but if we fight them in the plains, surely we shall overpower them. Thus armies clashed again, this time on the flatlands of Aphek. Israel's fighters looked like two small flocks of goats beside the vast host of Aram. Yet once more the word of the Lord came. Because Aram has said, the Lord is a God of the hills, but not of the valleys. Therefore I will give all this great multitude into your hand. For 7 days the armies camped opposite one another. On the 7th day, battle was joined, and Israel struck down 100,000 in a single day. The walls of Aphek collapsed, crushing thousands more. Ben-Hadad, beaten and humiliated, begged for mercy, and Ahab, seizing the moment, spared him, calling him brother and sending him home with treaty promises. But the prophet's voice followed. By sparing one marked for destruction, Ahab had traded obedience for diplomacy. "Because you have let go the man whom I had devoted to destruction," the prophet declared. "Your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people." But with it a warning sharper than any sword. Israel's king had tasted deliverance, but his disobedience had sown the seed of ruin yet to come. Ramoth-Gilead lay on the eastern frontier, a fortress city disputed for years between Israel and Aram. Ahab, restless and ambitious still, could not let it remain outside his grasp. He summoned Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, into alliance, cloaking political hunger in the language of brotherhood. The two kings sat robed in splendor at the gates of Samaria, 400 prophets declaring in unison that victory was certain, yet their chorus sounded too smooth, too rehearsed. Jehoshaphat pressed for another voice, and Micaiah, son of Imlah, was brought, reluctant, iron chains already familiar to him. Micaiah's vision cut against the tide. He saw Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd, and a heavenly court in which a lying spirit had gone forth to entice Ahab into battle. Doom had been decreed, though Ahab, angered, dismissed it as insolence. "Put him in prison," he commanded. "Feed him with bread of affliction until I return in peace." Yet Micaiah's final words rang like iron. "If you return at all, the Lord has not spoken by me." Even so, Ahab marched to Ramoth-Gilead, but he went cloaked in suspicion, wary of prophecy's bite. He disguised himself in common armor, while Jehoshaphat rode in kingly robes, a decoy to draw Aram's fury. The Aramean chariots did indeed swarm toward the Judean king, mistaking him for their true quarry, until his cry revealed the error and they turned away. Ahab's disguise had worked almost. For in the chaos of battle, an archer drew his bow at random, the text says. A chance shot loosed into the melee. Yet no arrow flies without aim in the hand of providence. It found the narrow seam between Ahab's armor plates, sliding past disguise and royal cunning, piercing flesh. The king slumped in his chariot, blood pooling at the bottom as the fight raged on. He ordered his driver to wheel away from the line, but he remained propped against the side, watching the day fade while life drained from him. As the sun dipped, the cry spread across the field. "Every man to his city, every man to his land." The battle dissolved into retreat. By nightfall, Ahab was dead, his disguise useless, his fate sealed exactly as the prophet had spoken. His body was brought to Samaria, buried with all the honors of kingship, yet the dishonor came soon after. The chariot, still stained with his blood, was washed in the pool of Samaria, where dogs licked it clean as harlots bathed nearby, a grim echo of Elijah's words. The king who had sought to outwit death by costume had learned that no robe nor armor could shield against the decree of heaven. Ramoth-Gilead stood contested still, but Israel's throne was empty. Ahab's reign ended not with triumph, but with blood in the dust, and his story a warning that no disguise can hide a man from judgment when his time has come. The shadow of Naboth's vineyard had not lifted when the prophet returned with words darker still. Ahab had fallen, but Jezebel yet reigned in Samaria, her influence undiminished, her pride unbroken. It was she who had steeled her husband's hand, who mocked covenant law, who ordered the death of Naboth with forged letters and false witnesses. Elijah, carrying the weight of judgment, came once more to speak not of rain or fire, but of a fate reserved for the queen whose hands were red with innocent blood. In Jezreel's streets, whispers ran ahead of him. The prophet who had called down fire now pronounced something more chilling. The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel, not in a palace chamber, not on a throne, but in the dust of the open ground. Her body would find no burial, her name no honor. To die unburied in Israel was shame enough, but to be torn by scavengers was the utter ruin of dignity. This was not merely death. It was humiliation, a stripping away of the queen's pride before the eyes of the very city she sought to command. The prophecy was not spoken lightly, nor from Elijah's own bitterness. It carried the rhythm of inevitability, as if the earth itself demanded balance. Naboth's blood cried from his vineyard, and the dogs of Jezreel, lean and restless, became the image of justice to come. Where she had wielded power in arrogance, she would be left powerless, her flesh no more precious than carrion. Elijah's words spread, carried by rumor, whispered in fear. Some laughed nervously, unwilling to believe such a fate for the queen who sat in ivory halls, painted and adorned, with servants at her command. But others remembered Carmel, remembered the silence of Baal, remembered fire that consumed water and stone. The prophet's voice had been proven before, and his vision now cast a shadow across Jezebel's splendor. For her part, Jezebel did not bow. If she heard the prophecy, she met it with scorn, for she had faced prophets before and silenced them. Yet the certainty of Elijah's voice lingered, a seed of dread sown in the soil of her reign. The very wall where she strutted in pride would one day be her undoing, the dogs she despised as filthy creatures destined to be her pallbearers. Thus the judgment was fixed. As Ahab's blood had been licked in Samaria, so Jezebel's flesh would be consumed in Jezreel. Elijah's grim prophecy was not a passing curse, but a vision of justice that waited, patient and sure, at the edge of her days. It foretold that power gained by deceit ends in shame, and that the one who mocks heaven cannot escape its verdict, no matter how high her walls. After Ahab's death, the crown passed to his son Ahaziah, a man who inherited not only his father's throne but his folly. The kingdom staggered in weakness, its armies bruised, its prophets still hiding, its people weary of wars and drought. Yet rather than turning to the God of Israel, Ahaziah followed the same crooked path that had undone his father. His heart was set not on covenant faithfulness but on foreign gods, and his reign began as it would end in rebellion against the Lord. Not long into his rule, Ahaziah suffered a fall from the upper chamber of his palace in Samaria, a sudden and humiliating accident. His body was broken, his strength drained, his future uncertain. In the silence of pain, he might have remembered how fire had fallen at Carmel, how his father's chariot had run red with blood, how Elijah's words had come to pass with frightening precision. Yet instead of humbling himself, he turned outward to strange altars. Messengers were dispatched to Ekron, a Philistine stronghold, where Baal-zebub, the so-called Lord of Flies, was worshipped as a god who could heal and divine destinies. Israel's king sought answers from Philistine idols rather than from the God who had once split seas and fed prophets with ravens. But the messengers never reached their shrine. On the road, a figure stopped them, a man wrapped in rough haircloth, leather belt about his waist. Elijah stood like a barrier between Israel's king and his chosen idol. His words were sharp, cutting through their excuses. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. The messengers returned, trembling, and Ahaziah, hearing their description of the hairy prophet, knew immediately who had spoken. Anger rose in him where repentance might have lived. He sent captains with 50 men to seize Elijah, as if soldiers could compel the word of God. But fire fell from heaven, consuming the troops as easily as kindling. Again he sent, and again fire descended. A third captain came, not with arrogance but on his knees, pleading for mercy, and his life was spared. Still, the message did not change. Elijah walked into the palace and stood before the king, weak on his bed, surrounded by attendants who could not shield him from truth. "You shall surely die," he repeated, not with triumph, but with the solemnity of inevitability. Soon after, Ahaziah breathed his last, and his brief reign ended as it had begun in defiance of the God he would not seek. Thus the house of Omri continued its descent, each heir choosing idols over covenant, each step carrying Israel further from its calling. In Ahaziah's turn to Baal-zebub, the tragedy deepened. The king of God's people seeking flies instead of the living God. His death sealed the warning: no throne, no alliance, no oracle could save a ruler who rejected the Lord of Israel. Word of Elijah's defiance reached the palace quickly, and Ahaziah's anger burned hotter than the fever in his broken body. From his sickbed he issued the order: seize the prophet. 50 soldiers under a captain marched out, armored and confident, dust rising behind them as they sought the man who had halted their king's messengers. They found him seated on a hill, as though waiting. The captain raised his voice, certain of his authority. "Man of God," the king says, "come down." It was command spoken in the name of earthly power, but it rang hollow against the silence of heaven. Elijah did not move. His eyes held no fear, only the steady fire of conviction. "If I am a man of God," he replied, "let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. Before the soldiers could laugh or raise their weapons, the sky itself answered. A blaze tore downward, searing the air, and in an instant the company was gone ashes on the hillside where moments before steel had glinted in the sun. News returned to the king, but instead of trembling, Ahaziah hardened his heart. Again he sent a captain with 50. The same demand carried on proud lips: "Man of God, come down at once." Elijah's reply did not falter, nor did heaven's fire. The earth shook with the second descent, and another band of soldiers was reduced to nothing but smoke rising against the horizon. The king's power was proved brittle. His command could not protect those who bore it. A third time, Ahaziah sent men, but this captain had seen enough of the world to know where defiance led. When he approached Elijah, he did not stand tall in command, but fell to his knees, his face in the dust. "Man of God," he pleaded, "please let my life, and the lives of these 50 servants of yours, be precious in your sight. Fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the former captains in their 50s, but now let my life be precious in your sight." Elijah regarded him, and the hardness that had called for judgment gave way to mercy. The word of the Lord came to him, bidding him go without fear. Rising from his seat, Elijah walked with the humbled soldiers back toward Samaria. There was no fire this time, no blaze from the sky, only the weight of inevitability in each step. In the palace, Ahaziah lay waiting, defiant to the last. Elijah stood before him, the same figure who had confronted Ahab in power and Jezebel in prophecy. His voice was calm, almost sorrowful, as he repeated the verdict: "Because you have sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, as though there were no God in Israel, therefore you shall not leave the bed to which you have gone up. You shall surely die." Fire had answered arrogance twice, and now the king himself awaited the final confirmation that no throne or army could withstand the word of the Lord. The time had come, though few could name it. Elijah felt it in the marrow of his bones, not as weariness alone, but as a summons drawing near. From Gilgal he set out, and Elisha, his faithful apprentice, walked at his side. Again and again Elijah urged him to stay behind at Bethel, at Jericho, testing the depth of his devotion. But each time Elisha answered with words that clung like iron: "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." The journey was no longer about distance, but about loyalty, about the passing of one life's fire into another's hands. When they reached the Jordan, the river ran broad and swift, its waters glinting under the sun. A company of prophets watched from afar, sensing the gravity of this moment. Elijah stood before the stream, his mantle draped over his shoulders, the rough cloak of hair that had become as much a symbol as a garment. He removed it, rolled it tight in his hands, and struck the water. At once the river recoiled, the current halting, the waters parting to left and right. The two men stepped forward onto dry ground, walking between walls of liquid crystal, as if through memory itself. The Jordan, which had borne Israel into the promised land under Joshua, now opened again for a prophet on the threshold of departure. As they crossed, silence hung heavy between them. Elisha broke it at last, his voice trembling but resolute. "Please, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." It was not greed, but yearning a son's request to carry the strength of his father, not half but double, to bear the weight of a burden too great for one man. Elijah looked at him with eyes both stern and tender. "You have asked a hard thing," he said. "Yet if you see me as I am taken from you, it shall be so." The river closed behind them, erasing their path, leaving only the future ahead. The mantle hung loose once more on Elijah's shoulders, but its weight already shifted, invisible, toward Elisha. The Jordan had not merely been crossed. A boundary had been marked, between past and future, between one prophet's fire and another's rising flame. Together they walked on, side by side, master and disciple, silence now rich with unspoken love and looming farewell. The prophets who watched from the far bank knew they had seen more than a miracle. They had seen a passage, a sacred handover, traced in water and sky. Soon the chariots of heaven would blaze. But first there was this quiet crossing, two men walking on dry ground where none should be, bound together by covenant, by calling, and by the mantle that would soon pass from one to the other. They walked on after the river closed behind them, the sound of their sandals against the earth the only rhythm between them. Elijah spoke little now, his gaze turned upward as though he already saw a horizon invisible to others. Elisha walked close, each step weighted with dread and devotion, unwilling to blink lest he miss the moment his master had spoken of. The air itself grew restless, wind stirring from no direction, the stillness of ordinary life giving way to something vast. Then it came. From the sky thundered a whirlwind, not like the storms that sweep valleys, but a tempest laced with fire. Within it blazed a chariot of flame, horses ablaze with light more searing than the sun. They descended not as visions, but as reality. The ground trembling under their approach. The fiery steeds reared, hooves striking the air, and the chariot cut between the two prophets like a blade of heaven, separating master from disciple. Elisha cried out, voice breaking, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." For he saw in that burning vision the true strength of the nation, not armies of men nor kings on thrones, but the prophetic presence that held covenant and truth aloft. His cry mingled awe and grief, a farewell and an affirmation all at once. Elijah did not resist the pull. His cloak billowed, his face set like one who had reached the journey's end. The whirlwind lifted him, bearing him upward in fire and storm, until his figure vanished into the blaze. He was gone, not laid in tomb or mound, but carried alive into the mystery of God, spared the decay of dust. The silence after was heavier than the thunder had been. Only one thing remained: the mantle, fallen from the sky, the rough cloak of hair that had once rested on Elijah's shoulders. It lay at Elisha's feet, ordinary in its texture, yet glowing with the weight of heaven's trust. Trembling hands reached down, lifted it, wrapped it across his own shoulders. The transfer was complete. The prophets on the far bank saw smoke swirling where the whirlwind had risen. They bowed, whispering among themselves, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." For though the master had gone in fire, his work continued on earth, not ended but transformed. Elijah's story closed not with death, but with ascension. His departure a promise that God's servants are never abandoned to futility. The fiery chariot became more than spectacle, it was testimony that heaven is never far, that the line between dust and glory is thinner than we dream, and that the lives given wholly to God are never truly lost, but caught up in the storm of eternity. The whirlwind faded, the fiery chariot vanished, and the roar of heaven dissolved into silence. Elisha stood alone on the far side of the Jordan, the dust still swirling where Elijah had been taken. His cry still echoed in his ears, my father, But there was no answer now, only the emptiness left by absence. Yet before him on the ground lay the mantle, rough, weathered, ordinary in its weave, extraordinary in its meaning. It was more than cloth. It was testimony, burden, and promise altogether. The master was gone, but his spirit had not departed from the earth. Elisha bent to pick it up, his fingers trembling. The cloak was heavier than he remembered, as though fire itself had soaked into its fibers. Draping it across his shoulders, he felt both the chill of loss and the weight of calling. He was no longer merely the plowman who had followed behind oxen, no longer the apprentice who had poured water on Elijah's hands. Now the mantle marked him as prophet in full, the vessel through which the same God would speak. But inheritance demanded proof. Elisha walked back toward the Jordan, the river flowing swift once more, its surface gleaming as if to test him. He rolled the mantle, just as Elijah had done, and struck the waters. His voice rose, not in arrogance, but in desperate faith. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the river parted, recoiling to either side as it had for his master. Elisha stepped forward across the dry ground, the mantle on his shoulders, the authority confirmed. On the opposite bank, the company of prophets who had been watching from a distance saw what had happened. Their eyes widened, and they bowed low, whispering the truth they could not deny. The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. The man who had once followed another now stood as leader, his master's fire alive in his own voice and hands. Yet even in triumph, grief lingered. The inheritance was not a crown but a cross, not glory but burden. The same mantle that parted waters would call down judgment, heal the sick, confront kings, and bear loneliness like Elijah had before. Elisha knew it. The river's parted path behind him was not just a miracle but a signpost pointing forward. His life would no longer be his own. Still, he walked on, shoulders squared beneath the rough cloak, the eyes steady despite the ache of loss. Elijah had risen in fire, but Elisha remained with dust and people and the long work of prophecy. The mantle had fallen, and with it a double portion of spirit, enough to carry him through what lay ahead. The age of one prophet had ended, but the word of the Lord had not grown silent. It now burned through another voice, clothed in a mantle that would not let the world forget the God of Israel. Years passed, but the memory of Carmel did not fade. The smoke had long since cleared from the altar of stones, the shouts of Baal's prophets silenced in the Kishon's waters. Yet the story lived on, carried in whispers and proclamations alike. To later generations of prophets, Elijah's stand became more than an episode of fire and rain. It was the very pattern of courage, a measure by which all prophetic voices would be weighed. Carmel was remembered not simply as victory, but as vindication. Yahweh alone is God. In the schools of the prophets, young men sat at their master's feet and heard the tale retold. They learned how one man, gaunt and alone, stood against a king, a queen, and 400 priests. They repeated the words that had cut Israel's indecision like a knife. "How long will you limp between two opinions?" The fire that fell was more than spectacle, it was revelation, proof that Yahweh answered, that covenant was not mere memory but living power. In every retelling, the prophets found their own mandate. They were heirs of a legacy that refused compromise, voices meant to pierce the complacency of rulers and the seduction of idols. Even the later prophets, Isaiah in his visions, Jeremiah in his laments, Malachi in his warnings, stood in Carmel's shadow. When they thundered against injustice, when they mocked false gods, when they called the people back to covenant faithfulness, they were walking in Elijah's footsteps. His defiance of Baal gave them license to challenge the powers of their own age. His solitude before the crowd reassured them that one voice, set on fire by truth, could outweigh multitudes. Carmel was not just history, it was template. Among the people, the memory took on another shape. Elijah became legend, a figure larger than life. Parents spoke of him to children as the prophet who called fire from heaven, the man whose prayers brought drought and rain alike. Around the hearths of Israel, his story was told with awe, until his name became a byword for divine power and zeal. When the land suffered again, when kings strayed, the people wondered if another Elijah would rise to challenge them, if the fire of Carmel might fall once more. Centuries later, the expectation deepened into hope. The prophet Malachi would declare that Elijah must return before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Thus Carmel's fire reached beyond its own age, sparking an anticipation that outlived kings and empires. Elijah was not only a reformer of his generation, but a figure straddling time, forever poised to come again, forever reminding Israel that covenant demanded choice. The legacy of Carmel was not the altar itself, now rubble, nor the rain that returned to the thirsty soil. It was the conviction carved into Israel's memory that Yahweh alone answers, that divided hearts cannot stand, and that one prophet, armed with faith and fire, can turn a nation's gaze back to the living God. Elijah did not die as other men. No grave marked his passing, no tomb held his body, no stone bore his name. He vanished in whirlwind and flame, leaving behind not silence but expectation. The people who told his story could never quite believe it was finished. And so Elijah became not only a prophet of the past, but a figure of memory and hope, suspended between what had been and what might yet be. Centuries after Carmel's fire, the prophet Malachi gave voice to this yearning. His words closed the scroll of Israel's prophets with a promise. Before the great and terrible day of the Lord, Elijah would return to turn the hearts of fathers to children and children to fathers. It was more than prophecy, it was assurance that renewal would not come without the same fierce voice that once rebuked kings and summoned fire. Elijah, they believed, had not ascended to vanish, but to wait, to return when history demanded him again. In the years that followed, this hope deepened into ritual. At Passover tables, a cup of wine stood untouched, set for the absent prophet. A door was opened to the night air, as though Elijah himself might walk in, herald of redemption. Children leaned forward to ask if he had come, while elders smiled and said, "Next year." The memory of his zeal became woven into the fabric of Jewish longing. Elijah would not only return but prepare the way for Messiah. His name became shorthand for expectation, his presence anticipated wherever God's final work was imagined. The New Testament writers found his shadow everywhere. John the Baptist, wild-haired, leather-belted, crying out in the wilderness, reminded the people of Elijah, and Jesus himself spoke of him as one who came in spirit and power to prepare the way. On another mountain, centuries after Carmel, Elijah stood again in glory, appearing beside Moses in the mystery of transfiguration, speaking with the Christ whose mission would fulfill the hope Israel had carried since Malachi's words. The fiery prophet who once mocked Baal's priests now conversed quietly about a different sacrifice, a different fire, a different triumph. In Christian memory, Elijah became forerunner, a bridge between covenants, the prophet who would not stay gone because his work was never only for one generation. In Jewish tradition, he remained the herald, the one who would announce the Messiah at last. At every Passover, every turning of history's wheel, the cup remains, the door opens, the hope endures. Elijah, the man from Tishbe, who once called down drought and fire, who fled into wilderness despair, who heard the whisper on Horeb, who ascended in flame, still lives in memory as the prophet who must come again. His story, unfinished, rests not only in the past but in the future, a promise that when God moves to restore all things, the voice of Elijah will be heard once more, fierce and faithful, calling hearts back to the God who answers.